In North Africa, the war was never just about territory. It was about survival, timing, and deception. Vast open landscapes offered nowhere to hide, and yet, somehow, entire armies vanished into heat haze and reappeared where they were least expected. Here, battles were decided not just by firepower, but by patience, coordination, and the ability to read the desert-like map written in shifting sand. On one such day, the British Eighth Army faced a force that had come to dominate the battlefield. The German armored units, fast, precise, and feared. Their tanks had a reputation for striking hard and disappearing just as quickly. But this time, something was different. The British had learned. They had adapted. And they were ready. What followed was not a chaotic clash, but a carefully unfolding engagement. One where positioning, discipline, and timing turned the tide. In a matter of hours, a series of calculated decisions would lead to the destruction of 52 German tanks, a blow that would echo far beyond the battlefield itself. This is the story of that moment, of how strategy overcame reputation, how preparation overcame fear, and how, in the vast emptiness of the desert, one army found a way to change the course of the fight. And before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to Britain War Diaries, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Every story, every memory, and every place matters. And together we keep history alive. Now let's begin. Chapter 1, Segment 1, The Desert Before the Clash. Before the moment when steel would collide and the outcome of an entire engagement would be decided in a matter of hours, there was the desert itself. Vast, indifferent, and quietly shaping every movement that took place upon it. And in North Africa, this landscape was not simply a backdrop to war. It was an active force, one that dictated how armies moved, how they saw each other, and how they fought. And as the British Eighth Army prepared for what would become a defining encounter, the desert stretched endlessly around them, its surface marked by faint tracks that could disappear within hours, its horizons blurred by heat and distance, creating a battlefield where visibility was both an advantage and a deception. And within this environment, the concept of distance itself became uncertain, as objects appeared closer or farther than they truly were, and as a result, both sides had learned that perception could not always be trusted, that what was seen was not always what was real. And, within this uncertainty, planning became essential, as every movement had to account not only for the enemy, but for the terrain that concealed and revealed it in equal measure. And for the soldiers of the Eighth Army, this was not their first experience of the desert. They had spent months adapting to its demands, learning how to navigate its emptiness, how to maintain supply lines across vast distances, and how to coordinate movements in a place where landmarks were few and constantly shifting. And, as they prepared for the coming engagement, there was a quiet understanding among them that this battle would not be won through force alone, but through the careful alignment of movement, timing, and awareness. And within their ranks, vehicles were positioned with intention, artillery was placed where it could cover expected approaches, and communication lines were established to ensure that information could move as quickly as the units themselves. And as dawn approached, there was a stillness that settled over the desert, a moment where everything seemed suspended between what had already happened and what was about to begin. And within that stillness, the Eighth Army waited, not passively, but with a sense of readiness that had been built over time, shaped by previous encounters and refined through experience. And they knew the nature of the force they were about to face, German armored units that had earned a reputation for speed and precision, capable of striking quickly and withdrawing before a response could be organized. And this reputation was not underestimated, but neither was it accepted as inevitable, because the British had observed, they had learned, and they had begun to understand the patterns behind those movements, recognizing that even the most effective tactics relied on predictability at some level. And as this understanding grew, it allowed them to prepare not just for what the enemy might do, but for how and when they would do it, and within this preparation, the desert itself became part of the plan, its openness used not as a vulnerability, but as a space where movement could be observed, anticipated, and responded to with precision. And as the first light of day began to spread across the horizon, illuminating the sand in soft tones of gold and shadow, the stage was set for an encounter that would test not only the strength of each side, but their ability to adapt, to read the environment, and to act at exactly the right moment. And, within this quiet beginning, there was no indication of the intensity that would soon follow, only the steady presence of men and machines, waiting within a landscape that had seen countless such moments before, and would see many more after. But for those present, this was not just another day in the desert. It was a moment that would define the outcome of a battle, and perhaps even the direction of the campaign itself. As the early light continued to spread across the desert, revealing the subtle contours of the terrain, and the carefully arranged positions of the British Eighth Army, the sense of anticipation deepened, not as a sudden surge of urgency, but as a steady awareness that the conditions for engagement were gradually aligning, and within this awareness, the preparation that had taken place in the hours and days before began to take on greater significance, as each decision, each placement of a unit, and each adjustment in positioning contributed to a larger structure that was now ready to be put into motion. And within this structure, coordination was essential, because the desert did not allow for disorganized action. It demanded clarity, precision, and timing, and the British forces had come to understand that success in this environment required more than strength. It required the ability to act as a cohesive system, where each element supported and reinforced the others, and as communication lines were checked and final observations were made. There was a quiet efficiency in the way the army prepared itself, an understanding that once the engagement began, there would be little room for hesitation or uncertainty, and within this preparation, the presence of the enemy was not yet visible, but it was felt, understood as an approaching force that would soon emerge from the horizon, and the knowledge of their capabilities shaped the mindset of those waiting, not as fear, but as respect for an opponent that had proven itself in previous encounters, and yet, alongside this respect, there was also a growing confidence, one that had been built through careful study and adaptation, as the British had begun to recognize the limitations within the enemy's approach, the patterns that could be anticipated, and the moments where their advantage could be challenged. And as this confidence settled into the ranks, it created a balance between caution and readiness, allowing the soldiers to remain focused without becoming overwhelmed by the scale of what was about to occur. And within the vehicles, crews made final adjustments, checking instruments, confirming positions, and ensuring that everything was in place for the moment when movement would begin. And outside, the desert continued its quiet transformation as the sun rose higher, bringing with it the heat that would soon distort visibility and add another layer of complexity to the battlefield. And this change in conditions was not ignored, it was accounted for, as part of the broader understanding of how the environment would influence the engagement. And as time moved forward, the stillness that had defined the early morning began to shift, replaced by a subtle sense of motion, as distant shapes started to form along the horizon, barely distinguishable at first, but gradually becoming clearer as the light increased. And within those shapes was the confirmation of what had been expected, the approach of German armored units, moving with the confidence and speed that had defined their operations. And as they advanced, the stage that had been prepared began to transition from potential to reality, as both sides moved toward a point where their strategies would intersect. And within this transition, the British Eighth Army remained steady, holding their positions, allowing the engagement to develop according to the structure they had established. And in this moment, the desert was no longer just a landscape. It had become a space of interaction, where movement, perception, and timing would determine the outcome. And as the distance between the two forces continued to close, the quiet anticipation that had defined the beginning of the day gave way to the first signs of action, marking the end of preparation and the beginning of a battle that would soon unfold with precision, intensity, and lasting consequence. Chapter 1, Segment 2. The First Movements, Reading the Enemy. As the distant shapes of German armored units gradually resolved into recognizable formations against the shimmering horizon, the abstract idea of an approaching force transformed into something immediate and tangible, and within the British Eighth Army's positions, attention sharpened not into panic, but into focused observation, as this was the moment they had prepared for, the moment when understanding would need to translate into action. And yet, even as the distance between the two forces continued to close, there was no rush to engage because the British commanders understood that in the desert, the opening moments of a battle were often the most revealing, not because of what was done, but because of how it was done, and so, rather than immediately committing their full strength, they watched carefully and deliberately, studying the movement of the German tanks as they advanced, noting the spacing between vehicles, the direction of their approach, and the subtle adjustments that indicated how they were reading the terrain, and within these observations, patterns began to emerge, confirming what had been learned through previous encounters, that the German units favored speed and flexibility, often probing the battlefield before committing to a decisive push, and this probing was not random, it was a calculated method of identifying weaknesses, testing responses, and creating opportunities for rapid exploitation, and as this became apparent, the British forces remained disciplined, resisting the impulse to react too quickly, because they understood that an early response could reveal their own positioning and intentions, and within this restraint, there was a quiet confidence, a belief that patience, combined with preparation, would allow them to shape the engagement rather than simply react to it. And as the German tanks continued their approach, their movements created faint trails of dust that rose into the air and lingered, partially obscuring their exact positions and adding another layer of complexity to the visual field. And within this shifting visibility, perception became an active process, requiring constant adjustment as distances changed and outlines blurred. And yet, despite these challenges, the British observers maintained their focus, communicating what they saw with clarity and precision, ensuring that the information being gathered was not isolated, but shared across the units, allowing the entire formation to develop a cohesive understanding of the situation, and as this shared awareness grew, it began to influence the readiness of the forces, as crews within tanks and artillery positions aligned themselves not just with their immediate surroundings, but with the broader picture of the battlefield, and within this alignment, the first elements of the British response began to take shape, not as sudden movements, but as subtle adjustments in positioning, slight shifts that refined their readiness without revealing their full intent, and as these adjustments continued, the distance between the two forces narrowed further, bringing them closer to the point where observation would give way to engagement. And within this transition, there was a sense that the battle had already begun, not through the exchange of fire, but through the exchange of awareness as each side sought to understand the other, to anticipate their actions, and to position themselves in a way that would provide the greatest advantage when the moment to act finally arrived. And in this way, the first movements of the encounter were not defined by speed or aggression, but by patience, perception, and the careful reading of an opponent whose reputation was built on precision. And as this phase unfolded, it set the foundation for everything that would follow, establishing a dynamic where knowledge and timing would prove just as important as firepower in determining the outcome of the battle. As the tension between observation and action continued to build, the German armored units began to demonstrate the next phase of their approach, shifting from distant probing into more defined movements that suggested a readiness to engage. And within this shift, their formations adjusted subtly, tightening in some areas while extending in others, creating a pattern that was both flexible and deliberate. And for the British Eighth Army, this was a critical moment, because it revealed not only the enemy's presence but their intent, and as this intent became clearer, the British commanders began to interpret these movements within the framework they had developed, recognizing that what appeared to be a straightforward advance was likely part of a more complex strategy designed to draw a response, to identify weak points, and to exploit any hesitation. And within this understanding, the British response remained measured, as they continued to hold their positions, allowing the German units to move further into the space that had been carefully prepared for them. And this decision required discipline, because it meant resisting the natural inclination to engage as soon as the enemy came within range. But it was precisely this restraint that allowed the British to maintain control over the development of the battle. And as the German tanks advanced, their presence became more defined, their shapes clearer, their movements more purposeful. And within this clarity, the reality of the encounter became undeniable, as the abstract idea of an approaching force was replaced by the concrete presence of machines and crews moving with intent. And yet, even as this reality settled in, the British forces remained composed, their actions guided not by the immediacy of the moment, but by the structure of their preparation. And within this structure, communication continued to play a central role, as information flowed between units, ensuring that each part of the formation remained aligned with the overall plan. And as this alignment was maintained, it created a sense of cohesion that extended beyond individual positions, allowing the army to function as a unified entity rather than a collection of separate elements. And within this unity, the first true moments of engagement began to approach, as distances closed to the point where action could no longer be delayed, and as this point drew nearer, the atmosphere shifted once again, moving from anticipation into readiness. And within this readiness, the British forces prepared to transition from observation to action, knowing that the decisions made in the next moments would determine not only the immediate outcome of the encounter, but the broader trajectory of the battle itself. And as the German units continued their advance, unaware of the full extent of the positioning and preparation that awaited them, the stage was set for a confrontation where the careful reading of movement, the disciplined control of response, and the precise timing of action would come together to shape a moment that would soon unfold with clarity, intensity, and decisive consequence, marking the true beginning of the engagement that would ultimately lead to the destruction of 52 German tanks. Chapter 1, Segment 3. The moment before fire, discipline over instinct. As the distance between the British 8th Army and the advancing German armored units narrowed to the point where engagement was no longer a distant possibility but an immediate certainty, the atmosphere across the battlefield shifted into a state that was both tense and controlled, a quiet threshold where preparation met reality. And within this threshold, the importance of discipline became more evident than ever, because in the desert, where visibility stretched across vast distances and movement could be observed long before it reached its target, the decision of when to act carried immense weight. And for the British forces, this moment required more than readiness, it required restraint, the ability to hold steady even as the instinct tone gauge grew stronger. And within their positions, tank crews remained focused on their instruments and surroundings, artillery units held their lines of fire without deviation, and commanders observed the unfolding movement with a clarity that came from both experience and planning. And as the German tanks continued their approach, their presence now unmistakable, their formations more defined, there was a growing sense that the battle was on the verge of beginning. And yet, despite this proximity, the British did not immediately open fire, because they understood that timing, not just accuracy, would determine the effectiveness of their response. And within this understanding, every second that passed was part of a larger calculation, one that considered distance, angle, terrain, and the positioning of both friendly and enemy units. And as these factors aligned, the moment to act drew closer. But still, it was not yet taken, and this restraint was not hesitation, it was control, a deliberate choice to wait until the conditions were exactly as required. And within this controlled waiting, there was a quiet intensity, as each individual remained aware of their role within the larger structure, knowing that when the order came, their actions would need to be precise, coordinated, and immediate. And as the German units moved further into range, their confidence in their advance still evident, there was little indication that they were entering a space that had been carefully prepared, and this lack of awareness was itself part of the British advantage, as it allowed them to maintain the element of surprise, not through concealment alone, but through the disciplined management of their response. And as the sun continued to rise, casting sharper light across the battlefield, the clarity of the scene increased, revealing the positions, movements, and distances with greater definition. And within this clarity, the final elements of the engagement began to fall into place, as the British forces reached the point where observation would transition into action. And within this transition, there was a brief but significant moment, a pause that existed not in time, but in decision, where everything was ready, everything was aligned, and all that remained was the choice to begin. And in that moment, the outcome of the initial exchange would be determined not by who acted first, but by who acted at the right time. And for the British Eighth Army, that understanding was the result of experience, adaptation, and a commitment to discipline that allowed them to hold steady even as the battle stood ready to unfold before them. As the final seconds before engagement stretched into what felt like an extended moment of suspended action, the internal experience of those within the British Eighth Army became defined by a heightened awareness, not of fear or urgency, but of precision, as every detail of the environment, every movement of the enemy, and every position within their own formation was held in focus. And within this state of awareness, the concept of instinct, which might have driven a more immediate reaction, was carefully balanced against the discipline that had been cultivated through training and experience. And this balance was essential, because in a situation where visibility was high and distances were measurable, acting too early could reduce the effectiveness of their fire, while acting too late could allow the enemy to gain an advantage. And so, the decision of when to engage was not left to impulse, but to calculation, a process that considered not only the present moment, but the sequence of actions that would follow. And as this calculation reached its conclusion, the readiness that had been building across the British positions reached its peak, as each unit, each crew, and each individual aligned themselves with the impending action. And within this alignment, communication played a final and critical role, as orders were confirmed, positions were locked in, and the entire formation prepared to act as a single, coordinated force. And as the German tanks continued their advance, now fully within the range that had been anticipated, their movement carried with it the confidence of previous successes, a belief in their ability to control the battlefield through speed and precision. And yet, this confidence did not account for the level of preparation that awaited them, nor for the disciplined restraint that had allowed the British forces to hold their positions until this exact moment. And as the tension reached its highest point, the transition from waiting to action became inevitable, as the conditions that had been carefully established were now fully realized. And within this realization, the decision to engage was no longer a question, but a certainty. And in that instant, the controlled stillness that had defined the moments before was replaced by the first decisive actions of the battle, as the British Eighth Army moved from observation into execution, initiating a response that had been shaped by patience, guided by understanding, and timed with precision. And as the first shots were prepared to be fired, marking the true beginning of the engagement, it became clear that what was about to unfold was not a spontaneous clash, but the result of deliberate planning and disciplined control, where every element had been aligned to create an outcome that would soon begin to take shape across the desert, transforming the quiet tension of the early morning into a decisive and coordinated action that would set the tone for the battle to come. Chapter 2, Segment 1. The Opening Fire, Precision Unleashed. The transition from silence to action did not come as a chaotic explosion, but as a controlled and deliberate release of force, the kind that had been held in check until the exact moment it could be used with maximum effect. And as the British Eighth Army finally initiated engagement, the first shots were not random or reactive, but carefully aimed, calculated, and coordinated across multiple positions, creating an opening strike that was designed not just to hit, but to disrupt. And within that first instant, the stillness of the desert was broken by the sharp, echoing sound of artillery and tank fire, rolling outward across the open landscape and marking the beginning of a battle that had already been shaped long before the first round was fired. And as British guns spoke in unison, their fire converged on advancing German units that had moved precisely into the zones anticipated during planning. And this convergence was not accidental. It was the result of disciplined observation and precise timing, ensuring that the enemy was engaged at a point where their movement, formation, and exposure created the greatest vulnerability. And within the German ranks, the sudden impact of this coordinated fire disrupted the rhythm of their advance, as vehicles that had been moving with confidence were forced into immediate reaction, some halting, others attempting to maneuver, and within this shift, the initiative began to change hands, not through overwhelming force alone, but through the effectiveness of that first controlled strike. And as the British continued their opening fire, they did so with measured consistency, maintaining coordination between units to ensure that their actions reinforced one another rather than becoming fragmented. And within this coordination, communication remained steady, allowing adjustments to be made in real time as observations were updated and targets shifted. And as the engagement developed, the importance of positioning became increasingly clear, as British units, already aligned with the terrain and the expected approach of the enemy, were able to maintain clear lines of fire while minimizing their own exposure, and this advantage allowed them to continue applying pressure without needing to reposition significantly, preserving the structure of their formation while steadily increasing the intensity of their response. And as the German forces attempted to regain their momentum, their movements became more reactive, shifting from the controlled advance they had begun with into a series of adjustments aimed at countering the unexpected resistance they now faced. And within these adjustments, gaps began to form, small at first, but significant enough to alter the cohesion of their formation. And as these gaps appeared, they created opportunities that the British forces were prepared to exploit, and as additional rounds were fired, each one guided by the evolving understanding of the battlefield, the engagement continued to build, not as a chaotic exchange, but as a structured and escalating interaction where each action was connected to a larger intent. And within this structure, the opening phase of the battle established a critical foundation, demonstrating that the British Eighth Army was not merely reacting to the German advance, but actively shaping the engagement from its very first moments, using precision, timing, and coordination to transform the initial contact into a decisive advantage that would continue to develop as the battle unfolded. As the opening fire settled into a sustained rhythm of engagement, the battlefield began to transform in both appearance and dynamics, shifting from a clear and open landscape into one defined by movement, sound, and the visible effects of coordinated action. And within this transformation, the British Eighth Army maintained its structured approach, ensuring that the intensity of their fire did not lead to disorder, but instead remained aligned with the broader strategy that had guided their preparation. And as additional units joined the engagement, the scale of the response expanded, creating overlapping zones of fire that limited the ability of the German forces to maneuver freely. And within these zones, the effectiveness of the British positioning became increasingly apparent, as their lines of fire intersected in ways that created continuous pressure on advancing units, forcing them to make rapid decisions under conditions that were no longer favorable. And as the German tanks attempted to adjust their formations, seeking angles and positions that would allow them to return fire effectively, they encountered a battlefield that had already been shaped against them, where movement was constrained not by physical barriers, but by the coordinated reach of British guns. And within this constrained environment, their usual advantages of speed and flexibility were reduced, as each attempt to reposition exposed them to additional fire from angles that had been carefully prepared. And as this dynamic developed, the engagement took on a new character, one where the initial disruption caused by the opening strike evolved into sustained pressure that continued to limit the effectiveness of the German response. And within this sustained pressure, the British forces demonstrated a level of control that reflected their preparation, as they adjusted their targeting, shifted their focus, and maintained communication in a way that allowed the engagement to remain coordinated even as its intensity increased, and as the battlefield became more active, with movement, sound, and visual elements combining into a complex and rapidly evolving scene. The clarity of the initial moments gave way to a more layered and dynamic environment, where perception required constant adjustment and awareness needed to be maintained across multiple levels, and within this complexity, the British Eighth Army continued to operate as a cohesive system, ensuring that each unit remained aligned with the overall objective, and as this alignment held, it allowed them to build upon the advantage gained in the opening moments, gradually increasing the pressure on the German forces while maintaining their own structural integrity. And as time moved forward, the engagement continued to unfold with a sense of controlled intensity, where each action contributed to a larger progression, and within this progression, the early success of the British response began to set the tone for what would follow, establishing a dynamic in which precision, coordination, and disciplined execution would continue to shape the outcome of the battle. As the initial exchange gave way to a broader and more sustained confrontation that would test both sides in new and increasingly demanding ways. Chapter 2, Segment 2. Breaking the advance, turning momentum. As the opening phase of the battle settled into a sustained and controlled exchange, the initial disruption caused by the British Eighth Army's precise engagement began to develop into something more significant, a gradual but undeniable shift in momentum that altered the direction of the encounter. And within this shift, the German armored units, which had advanced with confidence and cohesion, now found themselves operating within a battlefield that no longer responded to their expectations. And, as they attempted to reassert control through movement and counteraction, they encountered increasing resistance from positions that had been carefully aligned to limit their options, and within this resistance, the British forces maintained their disciplined approach, continuing to apply pressure without overextending, ensuring that their actions remained coordinated and effective, and as the German tanks adjusted their formations, seeking to regain the initiative, their movements became more reactive, less structured, as they responded to incoming fire from multiple directions, and within this reactive state, the cohesion that had defined their advance began to weaken, not through a sudden collapse, but through a series of small disruptions that accumulated over time, and as these disruptions increased, they created gaps within the formation, areas where the alignment between units was no longer as precise, and within these gaps, the British forces found opportunities to focus their fire, directing attention toward points of vulnerability that had not existed in the earlier stages of the advance. And as this focused engagement continued, the effect was not only physical but structural. As the German formation became increasingly fragmented, its ability to operate as a unified force reduced by the constant pressure applied across its front. And within this fragmentation, communication between units became more challenging, as the need to respond quickly to immediate threats limited the ability to coordinate broader movements, and as a result, individual units were often forced to act independently, making decisions based on local conditions rather than the overall strategy. And within this shift from coordinated advance to localized response, the advantage began to move steadily toward the British, as their preparation allowed them to maintain a cohesive structure even as the battlefield became more complex. And as this advantage grew, it influenced not only the physical dynamics of the engagement but also the perception of control, as the British forces were able to dictate the flow of the battle, shaping where and how the engagement unfolded. And within this controlled progression, the initial moments of precision and restraint gave way to a broader demonstration of tactical effectiveness, where the combination of positioning, timing, and sustained pressure created conditions that increasingly favored the British approach. And as the German units continued to attempt adjustments, seeking to break free from the constraints imposed upon them, they found that each movement brought new challenges, as the structure of the battlefield itself, shaped by British planning and execution, limited their ability to regain the momentum they had once held, and in this way, the breaking of the advance was not a single moment, but a process, one that unfolded gradually as each action, each adjustment, and each response contributed to a growing imbalance that would continue to define the engagement as it moved forward. As the battle progressed and the momentum continued to shift, the effects of sustained pressure became more pronounced, transforming the engagement from a contest of movement into a contest of endurance, awareness, and adaptability. And within this transformation, the British Eighth Army maintained its structured approach, ensuring that their increasing advantage did not lead to overconfidence or disorder, but remained aligned with the principles that had guided their initial success. And as they continued to engage the German forces, their actions became more deliberate in targeting the evolving weaknesses within the enemy formation, focusing not only on immediate opportunities, but on how each action would influence the broader development of the battle. And within this deliberate approach, the British forces demonstrated an understanding that momentum, once gained, needed to be carefully managed, as uncontrolled pursuit could create vulnerabilities just as easily as it could exploit them. And as a result, their movements remained measured, advancing only when conditions supported it, and maintaining their positions when stability provided the greater advantage. And within this balance, the structure of their formation remained intact, allowing them to continue applying pressure without compromising their own coordination. And as the German units attempted to respond to this sustained and controlled engagement, their options became increasingly limited, as the environment in which they operated offered fewer and fewer opportunities to regain their previous flexibility. And within this constrained space, their movements became more focused on immediate survival and response rather than strategic repositioning. And as this shift took place, it further reduced their ability to influence the overall direction of the battle, as their actions became reactive rather than proactive. And within this dynamic, the British forces were able to continue shaping the engagement, directing its flow and maintaining the initiative that had been established in the opening moments. And as time passed, the cumulative effect of these conditions became more evident, as the German formation, once cohesive and confident, now operated under continuous pressure, its structure weakened and its movements constrained. And within this evolving scenario, the battlefield itself reflected the changing balance of control, as areas that had once been open to maneuver became zones of restriction, defined by the reach and coordination of British fire. And as this transformation continued, the engagement moved steadily toward a point where the initial disruption would give way to a more decisive phase, one where the accumulated effects of pressure, fragmentation, and controlled action would begin to produce outcomes that extended beyond immediate engagement and into the broader consequences of the battle. And within this progression, the British Eighth Army remained consistent in their approach, demonstrating that the breaking of the German advance was not achieved through a single action, but through a sustained and disciplined application of strategy, one that balanced precision with patience and control with adaptability, ultimately creating the conditions that would allow them to move from disruption into decisive advantage as the battle continued to unfold. Chapter 2, Segment 3, Collapse of Formation when Control is Lost. As the engagement continued to unfold under sustained pressure, the gradual weakening of the German armored formation began to reach a point where its effects were no longer subtle or contained, but increasingly visible across the battlefield, transforming what had once been a structured and coordinated advance into something far more fragmented and uncertain. And within this transformation, the loss of cohesion became the defining characteristic of the German response, as the alignment between units, which had initially allowed for coordinated movement and mutual support, began to break down under the constant and precisely applied pressure from the British Eighth Army. And as this breakdown progressed, the battlefield itself reflected the shift, with previously organized lines of advance giving way to scattered movements, individual units adjusting independently rather than as part of a unified whole. And within this scattering, the ability to maintain a clear and consistent strategy diminished as each unit became increasingly focused on immediate conditions rather than the broader objective. And this shift from coordinated action to localized reaction marked a critical turning point, because it signaled not just a disruption of movement, but a disruption of control. And within this loss of control, the advantages that had once defined the German approach, speed, precision, and adaptability, were no longer as effective because they relied on cohesion to function at their highest level. And without that cohesion, these strengths became limited, unable to produce the same level of coordinated impact. And as the British forces continued to apply pressure, they did so with an awareness of this change, recognizing that the fragmentation of the enemy formation created new opportunities to exploit, and within these opportunities, their actions became more focused, targeting areas where the lack of coordination made units more vulnerable, and as these targeted engagements continued, they reinforced the ongoing breakdown, creating a feedback effect where each disruption made the next more likely. And within this cycle, the German forces found themselves increasingly constrained, their movements restricted not only by the external pressure applied by the British, but also by the internal disorganization that limited their ability to respond effectively. And as this dual pressure intensified, the battlefield took on a new dynamic, one where the initiative was firmly held by the British Eighth Army, and where the German units were forced into a defensive and reactive posture that was not aligned with their original intent. And within this posture, the loss of control became more pronounced, as attempts to reorganize were complicated by the ongoing engagement, making it difficult to restore the cohesion that had been present at the beginning of the battle. And as time continued to pass, the cumulative effect of these conditions pushed the engagement further toward a decisive phase, where the collapse of formation was no longer a gradual process, but an accelerating one, driven by the sustained application of pressure and the inability of the German forces to re-establish the structure necessary to regain control. And in this way, the battlefield became a space where the consequences of earlier actions were fully realized, as the careful preparation and disciplined execution of the British Eighth Army translated into a tangible and growing advantage, one that would continue to expand as the engagement moved forward. As the fragmentation of the German armored formation deepened into a more pronounced collapse, the nature of the engagement shifted once again, moving beyond the contest off momentum into a phase where the balance of control had clearly and decisively changed. And within this new phase, the British Eighth Army was no longer simply shaping the battle. They were directing it, guiding its progression through coordinated action and sustained awareness, while the German forces struggled to adapt to conditions that no longer supported their original approach. And as this imbalance became more evident, the battlefield evolved into a series of localized engagements, where individual units operated within increasingly isolated conditions, separated not only by distance, but by the breakdown of communication and coordination that had once connected them. And within these isolated pockets, the ability to respond effectively was reduced, as each unit faced its own set of challenges without the support of a cohesive structure, and as a result, their actions became more limited in scope, focused on immediate survival rather than strategic repositioning. And this limitation further reinforced the advantage held by the British forces, who continued to operate within a unified framework, allowing them to apply pressure in a way that was both consistent and adaptive. And as they identified areas where the collapse of formation had created significant vulnerability, they directed their efforts accordingly, concentrating their fire and attention on points where the impact would be greatest. And within this targeted approach, the effectiveness of their strategy became increasingly apparent, as each successful engagement contributed to the ongoing reduction of the enemy's operational capability. And as this process continued, the cumulative effect began to take shape, not as a sudden or singular event, but as a steady and undeniable progression toward a decisive outcome. And within this progression, the psychological dimension of the battle also became more pronounced, as the contrast between coordinated control and fragmented response influenced how each side experienced the engagement. With the British forces maintaining a sense of alignment and purpose, while the German units operated under increasing pressure and uncertainty. And as this contrast deepened, it further reinforced the existing imbalance, making it more difficult for the German forces to recover their previous level of effectiveness. And within this environment, the final stages of the engagement began to approach, as the collapse of formation set the conditions for outcomes that would soon become measurable and concrete. And as the British Eighth Army continued to execute their strategy with precision and discipline, the battle moved steadily toward its conclusion, with each moment building upon the last, and with each action contributing to air assault that had been shaped not by chance, but by a deliberate and sustained application of planning, awareness, and control, ultimately leading toward the destruction of a significant portion of the German armored force. and marking a moment in the campaign where the balance of power on the battlefield was clearly and decisively altered. Chapter 3, Segment 1. The Encirclement, Cutting Off Escape. As the collapse of the German armored formation continued to deepen, the battlefield entered a new phase, one defined not just by fragmentation, but by the deliberate shaping of space itself. As the British Eighth Army began to transform their growing advantage into a structured encirclement. And within this shift, the engagement moved beyond disruption and into control as the British forces, maintaining their cohesion and awareness, adjusted their positioning in a way that gradually limited the remaining options available to the German units, and this was not achieved through sudden or aggressive movement, but through a series of calculated adjustments, each one designed to close gaps, extend lines of fire, and create overlapping zones of influence that reduced the enemy's ability to maneuver freely. And as these adjustments took place, the concept of the battlefield itself began to change, as what had once been an open expanse became increasingly defined by invisible boundaries, shaped not by terrain alone, but by the reach and coordination of British units. And within these boundaries, the German forces found themselves operating in a space that was becoming progressively more constrained, where each movement carried greater risk, and where the possibility of retreat or repositioning began to diminish. And as this realization took hold, the dynamics of the engagement shifted further, as the focus of the German units moved from regaining initiative to seeking viable paths of movement. And within this search, the lack of cohesion that had already weakened their formation now became a critical limitation, as the absence of coordinated action made it difficult to identify and exploit any potential openings, and as a result, their movements became increasingly hesitant and localized, further reinforcing the control held by the British forces. And within this controlled environment, the British Eighth Army continued to operate with precision, ensuring that their encirclement was not rushed but steadily developed, maintaining pressure while allowing the structure of their positioning to solidify. And as the structure became more defined, it created a situation where the German units were not simply engaged, but contained, their ability to influence the broader battlefield reduced by the narrowing space in which they could operate. And as the encirclement pressed, the psychological dimension of the battle became more pronounced, as the awareness of limited options began to affect decision-making, leading to further fragmentation and hesitation. And within this environment, the British forces maintained their discipline, resisting the temptation to overextend or break formation, understanding that the effectiveness of their approach depended on maintaining the integrity of their positioning. And as time continued to pass, the encirclement became more complete, not through a single decisive movement, but through the accumulation of controlled actions that gradually transformed the battlefield into a space where the outcome was increasingly determined by the structure imposed by the British Eighth Army. And within this transformation, the engagement moved closer to a point where the remaining German units would no longer be able to operate effectively, setting the stage for the next phase of the battle, where containment would give way to decisive results. As the encirclement tightened and the remaining German units found themselves operating within an increasingly confined and controlled space, the effects of this strategic positioning began to manifest more clearly, both in the physical dynamics of the battlefield and in the internal experience of those involved. And within this confined environment, the options that had once defined the German approach, speed, flexibility, and coordinated maneuver, were now significantly reduced, as the ability to move freely across the desert was replaced by the necessity to navigate within boundaries that were constantly reinforced by British positioning and fire. And as these boundaries became more restrictive, the nature of movement itself changed, shifting from purposeful advance to cautious adjustment. And within this shift, the tempo of the German response slowed, as each decision required greater consideration, and each movement carried a higher level of risk. And as a result, the initiative that had once driven their actions was replaced by a reactive posture, one that further limited their ability to influence the course of the battle. And within this environment, the British Eighth Army continued to refine their control, ensuring that the encirclement remained effective and adaptable, as they responded to the remaining movements of the German units with precision and coordination. And as communication remained strong across their formation, they were able to maintain a cohesive understanding of the battlefield, allowing them to adjust their positioning in ways that reinforced their advantage while preventing any significant escape or breakthrough. And within this coordinated approach, the encirclement was not simply a static condition, but a dynamic structure, one that evolved in response to the actions of the enemy while maintaining its overall integrity. And as this dynamic continued to develop, the pressure on the German units increased, not only through direct engagement, but through the growing awareness that their operational space was shrinking, and within this awareness, the psychological impact of the encirclement became more pronounced as the realization of limited options influenced decision-making, often leading to further fragmentation and reduced effectiveness. And as the British forces continued to apply their strategy with discipline and control, the battlefield moved steadily toward a decisive phase, where the containment achieved through encirclement would translate into tangible outcomes, and within this progression, the structure of the British approach remained consistent, demonstrating that their success was not the result of isolated actions, but of a cohesive and sustained effort to shape the battlefield in a way that aligned with their objectives. And as the encirclement reached a point of near completion, the stage was set for the final developments of the engagement, where the remaining German units, constrained and fragmented, would face the full consequence of a battle that had been carefully guided from its opening moments to this critical stage, marking a turning point not only in the immediate encounter, but in the broader understanding of how preparation, discipline, and strategic awareness could be used to achieve decisive results in the challenging and unpredictable environment of the desert. Chapter 3, Segment 2. The Kill Zones, where the battle was decided. As the encirclement established by the British 8th Army reached a level of stability and control, the nature of the battlefield underwent another significant transformation, one that shifted the engagement from containment into concentrated impact, as the space within which the German armored units operated became not only restricted, but strategically defined in ways that amplified the effectiveness of British firepower. And within this defined space, certain areas emerged as points of intensified engagement, zones where positioning, visibility, and coordination combined to create conditions that heavily favored the British forces. And these areas, while not marked by physical boundaries, were shaped by overlapping lines of fire and carefully aligned units, creating what could be understood as zones of concentrated influence, where any movement by the German units would expose them to immediate and coordinated response. And as the battle continued, these zones became increasingly significant as they represented the culmination of earlier planning and execution, translating the abstract concepts of positioning and timing into tangible effects on the battlefield. And within these zones, the German units, already fragmented and operating under pressure, found themselves at a further disadvantage, as their ability to maneuver was not only limited by the encirclement, but also by the heightened risk associated with movement through these areas, and as a result, their actions became more constrained, often limited to small adjustments rather than decisive maneuvers. And within this constrained environment, the British forces maintained their disciplined approach, ensuring that their actions within these zones were coordinated and precise, maximizing the effectiveness of their engagement while minimizing unnecessary exposure. And as communication continued to function efficiently across their formation, they were able to identify where these zones were most effective and adjust their focus accordingly, reinforcing areas where pressure could be applied most successfully. And as this process continued, the battlefield became increasingly structured, not in a static sense, but in a dynamic way that allowed the British forces to guide the flow of the engagement, directing movement into areas where their advantage was strongest. And within this guided flow, the German units faced a series of difficult choices, as attempts to reposition or escape often led them into these zones where the concentration of British fire made sustained movement increasingly difficult. And as this pattern developed, the cumulative effect of these engagements began to take shape, not as isolated incidents, but as part of a broader progression that steadily reduced the operational capability of the German force. And within this progression, the concept of control became more pronounced, as the British Eighth Army demonstrated their ability to shape not only the overall direction of the battle but also the specific conditions under which it unfolded, and as the engagement continued, the importance of these zones of concentrated influence became increasingly clear, as they represented the points where preparation, positioning, and execution converged to produce measurable results, setting the stage for the outcomes that would soon define the battle. As the engagement within these concentrated zones intensified, the cumulative pressure exerted by the British Eighth Army began to produce outcomes that were both immediate and progressive, as the German armored units, already constrained by the encirclement and affected by fragmentation, found themselves operating within an environment where each movement carried significant risk, and where the ability to respond effectively was increasingly limited, and within this environment the concept of initiative had shifted almost entirely, as the British forces dictated not only where engagement would occur, but also how it would unfold, and as a result, the German units were often placed in positions where their actions were determined by necessity rather than strategy, and this reactive posture further reduced their ability to influence the course of the battle, reinforcing the advantage held by the British. And as the British forces continued to apply their strategy with precision, they maintained a careful balance between pressure and control, ensuring that their actions remained aligned with the overall structure of the engagement, and within this balance, they avoided the potential risks associated with overextension, instead allowing the conditions they had created to work in their favor, gradually increasing the effectiveness of their actions over time. And as communication remained consistent across their formation, they were able to coordinate their efforts in a way that reinforced the impact of each engagement, creating a sense of continuity and cohesion that extended across the battlefield. And within this coordinated approach, the outcomes of individual engagements began to accumulate, contributing to a broader pattern that steadily reduced the strength and effectiveness of the German force. And as this pattern became more pronounced, the battlefield itself reflected the changing balance, as areas that had once been contested became increasingly dominated by British control, and within these areas, the effects of sustained and precise engagement were evident, not only in the immediate results, but in the overall reduction of the enemy's ability to operate effectively. And as this reduction continued, the engagement moved closer to a point where the outcomes would become clearly defined, as the combination of encirclement, concentrated zones of influence, and disciplined execution created conditions that were increasingly difficult for the German forces to overcome, and within this progression, the British Eighth Army demonstrated a level of control and effectiveness that reflected the depth of their preparation. As they continued to guide the engagement toward a decisive conclusion, and as the battle approached this stage, it became clear that the zones of concentrated influence were not simply areas of engagement, but the focal points where the outcome of the battle was being determined, illustrating how the careful alignment of strategy, positioning, and execution could transform the dynamics of an encounter, leading to results that extended far beyond the immediate moment and into the broader narrative of the campaign. Chapter 3, Segment 3, The Final Break, Destruction of the Armored Force. As the battle entered its decisive phase, the cumulative effects of encirclement, sustained pressure, and the creation of concentrated zones of engagement began to converge into a moment where the outcome was no longer uncertain, but steadily revealing itself across the battlefield. And within this convergence, the German armored units, once advancing with coordination and confidence, were now operating under conditions that severely limited their effectiveness, their movements constrained, their formations fragmented, and their ability to respond reduced by the continuous and precisely applied pressure from the British Eighth Army. And as these conditions intensified, the engagement shifted from a contest of maneuver into a phase of resolution, where the structural advantages established by the British forces translated directly into tangible results. And within this phase, the British maintained their disciplined approach, ensuring that their actions remained coordinated and aligned with the broader objective as they continued to engage the remaining German units with precision, targeting areas where the effects would be most significant. And as these engagements took place, the battlefield reflected the changing balance of power, as the areas of control established earlier now became the spaces where decisive outcomes were being achieved, and within these spaces, the German units faced increasing difficulty in maintaining any form of organized resistance, as the lack of cohesion and the constraints imposed by the battlefield limited their ability to operate effectively, and as a result, their actions became more isolated, each unit responding to immediate conditions without the support of a coordinated structure. And within this isolation, the effectiveness of their response diminished further, as the advantages of mutual support and coordinated movement were no longer available, and as the British forces continued to apply their strategy, they did so with a clear understanding of this dynamic, focusing their efforts on maintaining pressure and preventing any opportunity for reorganization. And within this sustained engagement, the cumulative impact of their actions became increasingly evident, as each successful engagement contributed to the overall reduction of the German armored force. And as this reduction continued, the scale of the outcome began to take shape, not as a sudden or singular event, but as the result of a series of coordinated actions that, when combined, produced a decisive effect. And within this progression, the destruction of individual units was not viewed in isolation, but as part of a broader pattern that steadily diminished the operational capability of the entire force. And as the British Eighth Army maintained their control over the battlefield, they ensured that this pattern continued to develop, guiding the engagement toward its conclusion with a level of precision and discipline that reflected the depth of their preparation. And as the final stages of this phase approached, the outcome became increasingly clear, as the German armored units, unable to recover their cohesion or regain control, faced the full consequence of a battle that had been shaped from its earliest moments by the careful alignment of strategy, timing, and execution. As the final moments of the engagement unfolded, the accumulated effects of the British Eighth Army's strategy reached their full expression, transforming the battlefield into a space where the outcome was not only visible but definitive. And within this final phase, the remaining German armored units, already weakened by fragmentation and sustained pressure, were no longer able to operate as an effective fighting force, their movements limited, their responses constrained, and their ability to influence the course of the battle reduced to isolated and increasingly ineffective actions. And as the British forces continued to engage with precision and coordination, they maintained their structured approach, ensuring that the final stages of the battle were conducted with the same discipline that had defined its beginning. And within this consistency, they avoided unnecessary risk, focusing instead on completing the process that had been set in motion through earlier actions. And as the engagement progressed toward its conclusion, the cumulative results became measurable, as the number of German tanks destroyed reached a level that reflected not only the intensity of the battle, but the effectiveness of the strategy that had guided it. And within this measurable outcome, the figure of 52 destroyed tanks emerged not as an isolated statistic, but as a representation of the broader success achieved through coordination, planning, and execution. And as this outcome became clear, the battlefield itself began to settle, the intensity of the engagement gradually diminishing as the remaining resistance was overcome. And within this transition, the contrast between the beginning and the end of the battle became evident, as the confident advance of the German armored units had given way to a decisive defeat, shaped by the structured and disciplined response of the British Eighth Army. And as the final actions were carried out, the importance of each phase of the engagement became apparent, as the initial restraint, the controlled opening fire, the breaking of momentum, the encirclement, and the creation of concentrated zones all contributed to the final result, illustrating how a battle of this scale was not determined by a single moment, but by the accumulation of carefully executed actions over time. And within this understanding, the destruction of the German armored force represented more than just a tactical victory. It demonstrated the effectiveness of a methodical approach to warfare, one that prioritized awareness, coordination, and discipline over impulsive action. And as the battlefield returned to a state of relative stillness, marked by the remnants of what had taken place, the significance of the engagement extended beyond the immediate outcome, contributing to the broader narrative of the campaign and reinforcing the importance of adaptation and preparation in achieving success. And in this way, the final break of the German armored formation marked not only the end of a battle, but a moment that would be remembered as an example of how control, when carefully established and maintained, could lead to a decisive and lasting result in the challenging environment of the North African desert. Chapter 4, Segment 1. After the silence, understanding what just happened. As the final exchanges of fire faded and the structured intensity of the battle gave way to a gradual return of stillness, the desert once again became quiet, but it was no longer the same silence that had existed before the engagement began. It was a silence shaped by what had just taken place, a space where the echoes of movement, coordination, and decisive action lingered beneath the surface, and within this altered stillness, the battlefield revealed the outcome of the encounter, not through dramatic motion, but through the absence of it, as the once moving German armored units were now reduced to still forms scattered across the landscape, marking the points where the progression of the battle had reached its conclusion. And within this scene, the British Eighth Army remained composed, their formation intact, their positions still aligned with the structure that had guided their actions, and as the immediate urgency of engagement receded, a new phase of awareness began to emerge, one that focused not on action, but on understanding, as those present began to process the sequence of events that had led to this result. And within this process, it became clear that the outcome had not been determined by a single decisive moment, but by a series of interconnected phases, each building upon the last, creating a progression that moved steadily from preparation to execution to resolution. And as this progression was reflected upon, the importance of discipline became evident, as the ability to maintain control, to wait for the right moment, and to act with precision had played a central role in shaping the engagement. And within this reflection, the desert itself appeared once again as a defining element, its openness having allowed for both the observation and the execution that characterized the battle. And as the British forces began to consolidate their positions, ensuring that the battlefield was secure and that communication remained clear, there was a sense of continuity between what had just occurred and what would follow, as the actions taken during the engagement now transitioned into the responsibilities of aftermath. And within this transition, the experience of the battle was not simply left behind, but carried forward, informing the understanding of those involved and contributing to the broader narrative of the campaign. And as this understanding deepened, it highlighted the relationship between preparation and outcome, demonstrating how the careful alignment of strategy, positioning, and timing could produce results that extended beyond immediate action. And within this awareness, the significance of the engagement became more than just the destruction of enemy units. It became an example of how a structured and disciplined approach could influence the course of a battle in a decisive way. And as the desert settled into its quiet state, the memory of what had taken place remained embedded within it, not as a visible marker alone, but as part of the ongoing history of the campaign, a moment where control had been established, maintained, and ultimately translated into a clear and measurable result. As the stillness of the battlefield continued to settle, the process of reflection expanded beyond the immediate scene into a broader consideration of what the engagement represented within the context of the campaign. And within this broader perspective, the battle was understood not as an isolated event, but as part of a larger sequence of actions and adaptations that defined the ongoing struggle in North Africa. And as this perspective developed, it became evident that the success achieved by the British Eighth Army was not simply the result of favorable conditions or isolated decisions, but the culmination of experience, learning, and adjustment over time. And within this cumulative process, each previous encounter had contributed to a deeper understanding of both the environment and the opponent, allowing the British forces to refine their approach in ways that were clearly reflected in the outcome of this battle. And as this understanding was considered, the importance of adaptability became increasingly clear, as the ability to observe, to learn, and to adjust had allowed the British to move beyond earlier limitations and to develop a method of engagement that effectively countered the strengths of the German armored units. And within this adaptive process, the role of coordination also stood out, as the success of the engagement depended not only on individual actions, but on the ability of the entire formation to operate as a cohesive system, where communication, positioning, and timing were aligned to support a common objective. And as this cohesion was maintained throughout the battle, it allowed the British forces to apply their strategy with consistency, ensuring that each phase of the engagement contributed to the overall outcome. And within this consistency, the contrast between the two sides became more apparent, as the British maintained their structure while the German forces experienced increasing fragmentation, highlighting the importance of maintaining control under pressure. And as the reflection continued, it also extended to the implications of the engagement, as the destruction of a significant number of German tanks represented not only a tactical success, but a shift in the balance of power within the immediate area, influencing the options available to both sides in the subsequent stages of the campaign. And within this shift, the engagement took on a significance that extended beyond the battlefield itself, contributing to the broader narrative of how control, preparation, and disciplined execution could shape the course of events in a complex and dynamic environment. And as the British Eighth Army continued their post-engagement activities, ensuring that their positions were secure and that their forces remained organized and ready for future operations, the experience of the battle became integrated into their ongoing understanding, reinforcing the principles that had guided their success and providing a foundation for future actions. And in this way, the silence that followed the battle was not an end, but a transition, a moment where the intensity of action gave way to the clarity of understanding, and where the lessons of what had just occurred would continue to influence the decisions and strategies that lay ahead. Chapter 4, Segment 2, Why It Worked, The Anatomy of Victory. As the immediate intensity of the battle gave way to a more reflective understanding of what had taken place, the question of why the engagement unfolded as it did began to take shape, not as a simple answer, but as a layered examination of the factors that had contributed to the outcome. And within this examination, it became clear that the success of the British Eighth Army was not the result of a single advantage, but of a combination of elements that worked together in a coordinated and deliberate way. And among these elements, preparation stood out as a defining factor, as the ability to anticipate the conditions of the engagement and to position forces accordingly created a foundation upon which all subsequent actions were built. And this preparation was not limited to physical positioning alone, but extended into an understanding of the environment, the enemy, and the dynamics of the battlefield, allowing the British forces to approach the engagement with a level of awareness that informed their decisions at every stage. And within this awareness, the desert itself was transformed from a neutral space into an active component of their strategy. As its openness was used to observe movement, its distances were used to control engagement timing, and its lack of concealment was turned into an advantage through careful positioning. And as this environmental understanding was combined with disciplined execution, it allowed the British forces to maintain control over the development of the battle, ensuring that their actions were not reactive but intentional. And within this intentional approach, timing emerged as another critical factor, as the decision of when to engage, when to hold position, and when to apply pressure was guided by a clear understanding of how each moment would influence the broader progression of the engagement. And this sense of timing was evident from the very beginning, as the British forces resisted the impulse to engage too early, instead allowing the German units to move into positions where they could be effectively targeted. And as this patience was maintained, it created the conditions for a more impactful phase, one that disrupted the enemy's advance and set the tone for the rest of the battle. And alongside timing, coordination played an equally important role, as the ability of the British units to operate as a cohesive system ensured that their actions reinforced one another, creating a level of consistency and reliability that was difficult for the German forces to counter. And within this coordination, communication was essential, as it allowed information to flow across the formation, enabling adjustments to be made in real time and ensuring that each unit remained aligned with the overall strategy. And as these elements, preparation, environmental understanding, timing, and coordination, came together, they created a framework within which the British Eighth Army was able to operate with clarity and control, shaping the engagement in a way that maximized their strengths while limiting the effectiveness of their opponent. And as this framework was applied consistently throughout the battle, it allowed the British forces to maintain their advantage from the opening moments through to the final stages, demonstrating that success in such an environment was not the result of chance, but of a carefully constructed approach that integrated multiple factors into a cohesive and effective strategy. As the analysis continued, another important aspect of the engagement began to emerge, one that was less about the structure of the British approach and more about how that structure interacted with the characteristics of the German armored units. And within this interaction, it became evident that the effectiveness of the British strategy was not only due to its own strengths, but also its ability to counter and neutralize the advantages of the enemy, and the German units, known for their speed, precision, and flexibility, relied on a style of engagement that emphasized rapid movement and the ability to exploit openings, and under different conditions, this approach had proven highly effective, allowing them to control the pace and direction of battle. But in this engagement, those strengths were systematically challenged, as the British forces created conditions that limited movement, reduced flexibility, and disrupted the coordination necessary for rapid and effective action. And within this disruption, the German units found themselves operating in a way that was not aligned with their strengths, as the need to respond to sustained pressure and constrained space reduced their ability to execute the maneuvers that had previously defined their success. And as this misalignment became more pronounced, it further amplified the advantage held by the British forces, as their approach was specifically designed to create and exploit these conditions. And within this dynamic, the importance of adaptability became clear, as the British Eighth Army demonstrated their ability to adjust their methods in response to the evolving nature of the campaign, learning from previous encounters and refining their strategy in a way that directly addressed the challenges posed by the German armored units. And as this adaptability was combined with the disciplined execution of their plan, it allowed them to maintain control even as the battlefield became more complex, ensuring that their actions remained effective and aligned with their objectives. And within this alignment, the cumulative impact of their approach became evident, as each phase of the engagement contributed to the overall outcome, reinforcing the effectiveness of their strategy and highlighting the importance of consistency in execution. And as the reflection expanded further, it also became clear that the success of the engagement was not only a result of tactical decisions, but also of a broader understanding of how to operate within the environment of the desert, where visibility, distance, and terrain played a significant role in shaping the dynamics of battle. And by integrating this understanding into their approach, the British forces were able to create conditions that favored their strengths while limiting those of their opponent. And in doing so, they demonstrated that victory in such an environment required more than just strength or numbers. It required a comprehensive and integrated approach that combined knowledge, preparation, and execution into a cohesive whole. And as this understanding settled into the broader narrative of the engagement, it provided a clear explanation of why the battle unfolded as it did, illustrating how the careful alignment of multiple factors could lead to a decisive and meaningful outcome, one that would continue to influence the course of the campaign and serve as an example of effective strategy in the challenging conditions of desert warfare. Chapter 4, Segment 3. The Impact, What This Battle Changed. As the understanding of how the battle was fought settled into clarity, attention naturally turned toward what the engagement meant beyond its immediate outcome. And within this shift, the significance of the British Eighth Army's success began to extend outward, moving from the specifics of the battlefield into the broader context of the North African campaign. And within this broader perspective, the destruction of a substantial number of German tanks represented more than a tactical victory. It marked a moment where the balance of operational capability began to shift in a measurable way, influencing not only the immediate conditions of the battlefield, but also the strategic options available to both sides moving forward, and as this shift took shape, it became evident that the reduction of German armored strength had a direct impact on their Abilitato project force, as tanks were not only instruments of engagement, but central components of mobility, coordination, and control within the desert environment. And within this understanding, the loss of these units created limitations that could not be easily or immediately replaced, affecting the pace and structure of future operations, and as a result, the British Eighth Army found themselves in a position where their own operational flexibility was increased, as the pressure previously exerted by German armored units was reduced, allowing for a broader range of strategic possibilities. And within this expanded range, the British forces were able to consider actions that might not have been viable under different conditions, reinforcing the idea that the outcome of a single engagement could influence the direction of an entire campaign. And as this influence became more apparent, the psychological dimension of the battle also began to emerge, as the success of the British forces demonstrated that the German armored units, despite their reputation, could be effectively countered through preparation, coordination, and disciplined execution, and this realization contributed to a shift in perception, not only within the British ranks, but also in the broader understanding of the conflict, as it challenged the notion of invincibility that had been associated with German armored tactics. And within this shift in perception, confidence played a significant role, as the British forces, having experienced the effectiveness of their approach, were able to carry that confidence into subsequent engagements, reinforcing the principles that had guided their success and providing a foundation for continued adaptation and improvement. And as this confidence was combined with the tangible results of the battle, it created a momentum that extended beyond the immediate moment, influencing both the mindset and the strategy of the forces involved. And within this momentum, the engagement became a reference point, a moment that illustrated the potential of a well-coordinated and carefully executed approach to overcome even well-established strengths. And as the desert returned to its quiet state, the impact of what had taken place remained, not only in the physical remnants of the battle, but in the ongoing development of the campaign, where each action, each decision, and each outcome contributed to a larger narrative that continued to unfold across the vast and challenging landscape of North Africa. As the broader implications of the engagement continued to be understood, the battle also took on a deeper significance in terms of how it reflected the evolving nature of warfare within the desert environment. And within this reflection, it became clear that the encounter represented more than just a moment of success. It illustrated a shift in how the British Eighth Army approached the challenges of North African combat, demonstrating an increased ability to integrate knowledge, experience, and adaptation into a cohesive and effective strategy. And as this evolution became more apparent, it highlighted the importance of learning within the context of ongoing conflict, as each engagement provided opportunities to refine methods, improve coordination, and develop a deeper understanding of both the environment and the opponent. And within this process of learning, the British forces were able to move beyond earlier limitations, adopting a more structured and deliberate approach that emphasized control, timing, and awareness. And as this approach was applied consistently, it allowed them to achieve results that extended beyond individual battles, contributing to a broader pattern of effectiveness that would continue to shape the campaign. And within this pattern, the engagement discussed here became a clear example of how preparation and execution could align to produce a decisive outcome, reinforcing the value of a methodical and disciplined approach to warfare. And as this understanding was carried forward, it influenced not only future actions, but also the way in which the battle itself was remembered, as it came to be seen not just as a moment of destruction, but as a demonstration of strategic effectiveness, where the careful alignment of multiple factors led to a result that was both significant and instructive. And within this perspective, the legacy of the battle extended beyond its immediate context, contributing to the broader understanding of how success could be achieved in complex and dynamic environments. And as the narrative of the campaign continued to unfold, the lessons of this engagement remained relevant, informing decisions, shaping strategies and reinforcing the principles that had proven effective. And within this continuity, the battle became part of a larger story, one that connected individual moments of action to the overarching progression of the conflict, illustrating how each engagement, when understood in its full context, contributed to the evolving nature of the campaign, and in this way, the impact of the British Eighth Army's destruction of 52 German tanks was not confined to a single day or location, but extended into the broader narrative of the war, where it served as both a turning point and a reminder of the importance of preparation, coordination, and disciplined execution in achieving meaningful and lasting results in the challenging conditions of desert warfare. Chapter 5, Segment 1: Inside the Tanks, the Human Experience of the Battle. While the battle itself can be understood through movement, positioning, and outcome, there exists another dimension that unfolds within the confined interiors of the tanks that carried the fight forward, a dimension shaped not by maps or formations, but by perception, awareness, and the human experience of operating within a machine in the midst of a rapidly evolving engagement. And within the British Eighth Army, the crews inside these armored vehicles experienced the battle in a way that was both immediate and structured, where their understanding of the wider situation was filtered through limited visibility, communication, and the constant need to interpret information quickly and accurately. And as the engagement began, the transition from waiting to action was felt not as a sudden shift, but as a focused intensification of awareness, as each crew member aligned themselves with their specific role, ensuring that their actions contributed to the overall function of the vehicle. And within this confined space, coordination was essential, as the effectiveness of the tank depended on the ability of its crew to operate as a cohesive unit, each individual responsible for a particular task, yet all connected through communication and shared intent. And as the first shots were fired, the experience within the tank became defined by a combination of observation and response, as the crew relied on instruments, visual cues, and communication from outside units to understand the evolving situation. And within this process, the limitations of visibility became a significant factor, as the open desert provided long lines of sight, but also introduced challenges such as heat distortion and dust, which could obscure details and create uncertainty. And as a result, the crew's perception of the battlefield was not always complete, requiring them to interpret incomplete information and make decisions based on a combination of what they could see and what they were told. And within this environment, the role of the commander became particularly important, as they were responsible for synthesizing information, directing the actions of the crew, and ensuring that the tank operated in alignment with the broader strategy. And as the engagement progressed, the internal experience of the tank crew was shaped by the rhythm of action, where periods of observation were followed by moments of precise and coordinated response. And within this rhythm, the sense of time could become altered, as the intensity of focus on immediate tasks reduced awareness of the broader passage of time. And as the battle continued, the crew remained engaged in a continuous process of adjustment, responding to changes in positioning, communication, and the evolving dynamics of the battlefield. And within this process, the importance of training and experience became evident, as the ability to perform tasks accurately and efficiently under pressure relied on familiarity with both the equipment and the environment. And as the British forces maintained their coordinated approach, the tank crews played a central role in executing the strategy, translating the broader plan into specific actions that contributed to the overall effectiveness of the engagement. And within this contribution, their experience was not isolated, but connected to the larger system in which they operated, illustrating how individual actions, when aligned with a cohesive structure, could produce results that extended beyond the immediate perspective of those within the tank. And as the battle moved forward, the internal experience of the crew remained focused and adaptive, shaped by the demands of the moment and the understanding that their actions were part of a larger and carefully coordinated effort that was steadily influencing the outcome of the engagement. As the engagement intensified and the structure of the battle continued to evolve, the experience within the tanks became increasingly defined by the interaction between internal coordination and external conditions, creating a dynamic environment where the crew had to continuously align their actions with both the immediate demands of their vehicle and the broader context of the battlefield. And within this dynamic, communication remained a critical element, as the flow of information between the tank and other units allowed the crew to maintain awareness of the evolving situation, even as their direct visibility remained limited. And as this information was received and interpreted, it informed the decisions made within the tank, guiding movements, targeting, and positioning in a way that ensured alignment with the overall strategy. And within this process, the ability to remain composed and focused under pressure was essential, as the confined space of the tank required each crew member to perform their role with precision. Evina's the external environment became increasingly complex, and as the battle progressed, the cumulative effect of sustained engagement began to shape the internal experience, as the continuous need for attention and coordination created a rhythm that was both demanding and structured. And within this rhythm, the crew developed a heightened sense of awareness, not only of their immediate surroundings, but of their role within the larger formation. And as this awareness deepened, it reinforced the connection between individual action and collective outcome, illustrating how each decision, each movement, and each response contributed to the overall effectiveness of the British Eighth Army's approach. And as the German forces continued to experience fragmentation and reduced coordination, the contrast between the two sides became more apparent from within the tanks, as the British crews, supported by consistent communication and clear structure, were able to maintain a level of control that allowed them to operate effectively even as the intensity of the engagement increased. And within this controlled environment, the experience of the battle was not defined by chaos, but by a continuous process of observation, interpretation, and action, where each moment built upon the last, creating a sense of progression that aligned with the broader development of the engagement. And as the final stages of the battle approached, the internal experience of the tank crews reflected the outcome that was becoming increasingly evident, as the sustained application of their coordinated actions contributed to the reduction of the German armored force. And within this realization, there was an understanding that their role, while focused and specific, had been part of a larger effort that had achieved a decisive result. And as the engagement concluded and the intensity began to fade, the experience within the tanks transitioned once again, moving from active coordination to a more reflective awareness, where the actions taken and the outcome achieved could be understood within the context of the broader battle, illustrating how the human experience within these machines was both an integral part of the engagement and a reflection of the disciplined and structured approach that had guided the British Eighth Army to success in the desert. Chapter 5, Segment 2: Command and Control Decisions that Shaped the Battle. Beyond the visible movements of tanks across the desert and the immediate actions carried out within them, there existed another level of the battle that was less apparent but equally decisive, a level defined by command, communication, and the continuous process of decision-making that guided the entire engagement from beginning to end. And within the British Eighth Army, this layer functioned as the connective structure that linked individual units into a cohesive force, ensuring that each action, no matter how localized, contributed to a broader and unified objective. And as the battle began to unfold, the importance of this structure became immediately evident, as the ability to interpret information, assess conditions, and make timely decisions allowed the British commanders to maintain control over the development of the engagement, even as the situation evolved in complex and sometimes unpredictable ways. And within this process, the role-of observation was fundamental, as commanders relied on reports from forward units, visual assessments of the battlefield, and an understanding of the terrain to form a clear picture of the unfolding situation. And as this picture developed, it informed the decisions that would guide the actions of the entire formation. And these decisions were not isolated or static, but part of a continuous flow, where each new piece of information required reassessment and adjustment, ensuring that the response remained aligned with both the immediate conditions and the broader strategy. And within this dynamic environment, timing once again emerged as a critical factor, as the effectiveness of a decision often depended not only on its accuracy, but on when it was made and how quickly it could be communicated and implemented. And as the British forces maintained their structured approach, the efficiency of their communication systems allowed for a relatively smooth flow of information, enabling commanders to coordinate actions across multiple units and to adjust their strategy in real time. And within this coordination, the concept of control extended beyond physical positioning into the realm of information, as the ability to maintain an accurate and up-to-date understanding of the battlefield allowed the British to anticipate developments and to respond proactively rather than reactively. And as the German forces began to experience fragmentation and reduced cohesion, the contrast between the two sides became more apparent at this level. As well as the British command structure remained intact and responsive, while the German ability to coordinate and communicate effectively was increasingly limited by the conditions of the engagement. And within this contrast, the advantage held by the British forces became more pronounced, as their decisions continued to shape the battlefield in ways that reinforced their strategic objectives. And as the engagement progressed, the cumulative effect of these decisions became evident, as each action, guided by a clear understanding of the situation, contributed to the gradual shift in momentum and the eventual outcome of the battle. And within this process, the role of command and control was revealed not as a separate aspect of the engagement, but as an integral part of it, one that operated continuously and in parallel with the physical actions taking place on the battlefield, ensuring that the entire operation remained cohesive, adaptive, and effective from beginning to end. As the battle moved into its more intense and decisive phases, the demands placed on the command structure increased, requiring a level of clarity and adaptability that could accommodate the rapidly changing conditions of the battlefield. And within this environment, the ability to maintain situational awareness became even more critical, as commanders needed to balance the flow of incoming information with the need to make timely and effective decisions. And this balance was achieved through a combination of experience, training, and a deep understanding of the operational framework within which they were working, allowing them to interpret information quickly and to identify the most relevant factors influencing the engagement. And as this interpretation guided their decisions, the British command structure demonstrated a capacity for flexibility, adjusting their approach as necessary while maintaining the overall integrity of their strategy. And within this flexibility, the ability to prioritize actions became essential, as not all developments on the battlefield required immediate or equal attention. And by focusing on the areas where their influence could have the greatest impact, the British commanders were able to direct their resources and efforts in a way that reinforced their advantage. And as the German forces continued to experience increasing fragmentation and loss of cohesion, their ability to maintain an effective command structure was further diminished, as communication breakdowns and localized responses limited their capacity to coordinate actions across the formation. And within this context, the British command structure gained an additional advantage, as the relative clarity and consistency of their communication allowed them to operate with a level of coherence that was no longer matched by their opponent. And as this coherence was maintained, it enabled the British forces to continue shaping the engagement, guiding its progression through a series of coordinated actions that reflected both the immediate conditions and the broader strategic objectives. And within this guided progression, the role of decision-making remained central, as each choice, no matter how small, contributed to the overall development of the battle. And as the engagement approached its conclusion, the effectiveness of the British command structure became increasingly evident, as the cumulative impact of their decisions was reflected in the outcome achieved, demonstrating how the ability to maintain control over both information and action could influence the course of an engagement in a decisive way. And as the battle came to an end and the focus shifted toward reflection and analysis, the importance of this layer of the engagement remained clear, illustrating that the success of the British Eighth Army was not only the result of their actions on the battlefield, but also of the decisions that guided those actions, ensuring that each movement, each engagement, and each adjustment was part of a cohesive and effective strategy that ultimately led to a clear and measurable victory in the challenging environment of the North African desert. Chapter 5, Segment 3, coordination under pressure, how everything worked together. As the layers of the battle are brought together, movement across the desert, the experience inside the tanks, and the decisions made at the command level, what begins to emerge is a deeper understanding of how coordination functioned as the central force that held everything in alignment, transforming individual actions into a unified and effective system. And within the British Eighth Army, this coordination was not a single element, but a continuous process that connected every level of the engagement, from the smallest actions within a tank to the broader strategic decisions that guided the entire formation. And as the battle unfolded, this process became increasingly visible, not through isolated moments, but through the consistency with which the British forces were able to maintain alignment across multiple layers of activity. And within this alignment, communication played a foundational role, acting as the thread that linked observation, decision-making, and execution into a cohesive whole. And as information moved across the formation, it allowed each unit to remain aware of both its immediate surroundings and its place within the broader structure, ensuring that actions were not taken in isolation, but as part of a coordinated effort. And within this flow of information, the clarity and reliability of communication became essential, as any disruption or misunderstanding could have led to misalignment and reduced effectiveness. And as the British forces maintained their communication systems throughout the engagement, they were able to preserve the integrity of their coordination, even as the battlefield became more complex and the demands on their attention increased. And within this preserved coordination, the relationship between different units became more dynamic as tanks, artillery, and command elements interacted in a way that allowed them to support and reinforce one another, creating a network of actions that extended across the battlefield. And as this network functioned effectively, it enabled the British forces to apply their strategy with a level of precision that would not have been possible through isolated actions alone. And within this precision, the concept of timing once again played a critical role, as the effectiveness of coordination depended not only on the alignment of actions, but on their synchronization, ensuring that each movement and each engagement occurred at the moment when it would have the greatest impact. And as this synchronization was maintained, it allowed the British forces to create a rhythm within the battle, a pattern of action and response that reinforced their control over the engagement. And within this rhythm, the ability to adapt became equally important, as coordination was not a fixed state, but a flexible process that needed to respond to the changing conditions of the battlefield. And as the British forces demonstrated their ability to adjust while maintaining alignment, they ensured that their coordination remained effective even as the situation evolved, and within this adaptability, the strength of their approach became more evident, as it allowed them to maintain consistency without becoming rigid. And as the battle progressed toward its conclusion, the cumulative effect of this coordination became increasingly clear, as the alignment of movement, communication, and decision-making contributed directly to the outcome achieved, illustrating how the integration of multiple elements into a cohesive system could produce results that extended beyond the capabilities of any individual component. And in this way, the coordination of the British Eighth Army was not simply a supporting factor, but a central element of their success, shaping the engagement at every stage and ensuring that their actions remained aligned with their objectives from beginning to end. As the engagement reached its final stages and the full extent of the British Eighth Army's success became apparent, the role of coordination could be seen not only in how the battle was fought, but in how its outcome was achieved, as the integration of multiple layers of activity, observation, communication, decision-making, and execution created a level of effectiveness that extended across the entire formation. And within this integrated system, each element supported the others, creating a structure where the strengths of individual units were amplified through their connection to the whole. And as the structure functioned under the pressures of the battlefield, it demonstrated a resilience that allowed the British forces to maintain control even as conditions became more demanding. And within this resilience, the importance of shared understanding became evident, as the ability of different units to interpret information in a consistent way allowed them to respond to changes without losing alignment. And as this shared understanding was maintained, It reduced the likelihood of miscommunication and ensured that actions remained coordinated even when decisions needed to be made quickly. And within this environment, the human element played a crucial role, as the individuals operating within the system were responsible for maintaining the connections that allowed coordination to function. And as they performed their roles with precision and awareness, they contributed to the overall effectiveness of the formation, illustrating how coordination is not only a structural concept, but also a human one, dependent on the ability of individuals to communicate, interpret, and act in alignment with one another. And as the battle came to an end, the effectiveness of this coordination was reflected in the outcome, as the British Eighth Army was able to achieve a decisive result while maintaining the integrity of their formation. And within this outcome, the importance of coordination extended beyond the immediate engagement, as it provided a model for how future operations could be conducted, reinforcing the principles that had proven successful and demonstrating the value of integrating multiple elements into a cohesive system. And as this understanding was carried forward, it contributed to the ongoing development of the British approach to warfare in the desert, influencing how subsequent engagements would be planned and executed. And within this continuity, the lessons of coordination remained central, illustrating that success in complex and dynamic environments requires more than individual skill or strength. It requires the ability to align multiple elements into a unified and adaptable system. And as the desert returned to its quiet state, the traces of the battle remained not only in the physical landscape, but in the understanding of those who had experienced it, providing a lasting example of how coordination, when effectively maintained under pressure, can shape the outcome of an engagement in a decisive and enduring way. Chapter 6, Segment 1. The silence after battle, what remained in the desert. As the final movements of the battle faded and the intensity that had once defined the desert began to settle into stillness, a different kind of atmosphere emerged, one that was quieter, slower, and marked by the absence of the constant motion that had filled the landscape only hours before. And within this transition, the desert itself seemed to reclaim its natural rhythm, as the sounds of engines, gunfire, and communication gradually gave way to a vast and almost overwhelming silence. And in that silence, the traces of what had occurred remained, not as active forces, but as remnants scattered across the terrain, subtle indicators of a conflict that had passed but had not entirely disappeared. And within this environment, the British Eighth Army found itself in a moment of reflection, where the focus shifted from action to understanding, from movement to observation, and from immediate decisions to the broader implications of what had just been achieved. And as units began to reorganize and assess their positions, the structured coordination that had guided them through the battle now served a different purpose, helping them transition into a state of consolidation, where the emphasis was placed on maintaining order and preparing for what would come next. And within this phase, the importance of clarity remained, as the ability to accurately assess the situation allowed the British forces to understand the extent of their success and the condition of their formation. And as this understanding developed, it provided a foundation for the decisions that would follow, ensuring that the momentum gained during the battle could be sustained beyond its immediate conclusion. And within the stillness of the desert, the physical traces of the engagement, tracks left in the sand, abandoned equipment, and the subtle changes in the landscape, served as quiet reminders of the intensity that had preceded this moment. And as these traces were observed, they contributed to a deeper awareness of the scale and complexity of the battle, reinforcing the significance of the outcome that had been achieved. And within this awareness, the human experience of the soldiers also began to shift, as the focus moved away from the immediate demands of the battlefield and toward a more reflective state, where the events of the battle could be processed and understood in a broader context. And as this process unfolded, it revealed the importance of not only what had been done, but how it had been done, highlighting the role of coordination, discipline, and decision-making in shaping the course of the engagement. And within this reflection, the British Eighth Army began to recognize the full extent of their achievement, not as a single moment of success, but as the result of a continuous and carefully maintained effort that had unfolded over time, and as the desert remained quiet, this recognition became part of the enduring impact of the battle, shaping how it would be remembered and understood in the days and months to come. And within this quiet aftermath, the transition from action to reflection marked the beginning of a new phase, one where the lessons of the battle would begin to take form, providing insights that would extend beyond the immediate experience and contribute to the ongoing development of strategy and understanding in the broader context of the war. As time moved forward and the immediate stillness of the battlefield began to settle into a more stable and enduring calm, the focus of the British Eighth Army shifted further toward consolidation and preparation. As the need to maintain the gains achieved during the battle became a central concern, and within this phase, the structured approach that had guided them through the engagement continued to play a vital role, ensuring that the transition from combat to stability was managed with the same level of discipline and coordination that had defined their actions on the battlefield. And as units reorganized and communication lines were reinforced, the emphasis remained on maintaining clarity and control, allowing the British forces to establish a secure and coherent position from which they could continue their operations. And within this process, the understanding of the battlefield evolved from a dynamic and immediate experience into a more comprehensive and reflective one. As the events of the battle were analyzed and interpreted in the context of the broader campaign, and as this analysis took place, it revealed not only the strengths of the British approach, but also the factors that had contributed to the fragmentation and decline of the German forces, providing valuable insights into the nature of the engagement and the conditions that had shaped its outcome. And within this broader perspective, the importance of coordination, timing, and adaptability became even more apparent, as these elements were identified as key contributors to the success that had been achieved. And as this understanding was developed and shared within the command structure, it began to influence how future operations would be planned and executed, ensuring that the lessons of this battle would continue to inform the actions of the British Eighth Army as they moved forward. And within this continuity, the transition from reflection to application became a defining feature of the aftermath. As the insights gained from the battle were integrated into the ongoing development of strategy and practice, and as the desert remained quiet and unchanged in its outward appearance, the significance of what had occurred within it continued to resonate, not through visible activity, but through the understanding and experience carried by those who had taken part in the engagement. And within this resonance, the impact of the battle extended beyond its immediate conclusion, shaping the course of future actions and contributing to the broader narrative of the campaign. And as the British forces prepared to move forward, the calm and reflective state of the desert served as a backdrop to this transition, reminding them of both what had been achieved and what remained to be done. And within this balance between past and future, the aftermath of the battle became not an end, but a continuation, a moment of pause that allowed for understanding and preparation before the next phase of the journey began, carrying with it the lessons, experiences, and confidence gained from a battle that had demonstrated the power of coordination and discipline in shaping the outcome of a complex and challenging engagement. Chapter 6, Segment 2. Understanding the outcome, why the battle turned. As the stillness of the desert settled more firmly over the battlefield and the immediate urgency of combat gave way to a slower, more reflective pace, attention began to shift toward a deeper question, one that extended beyond the visible outcome and into the underlying reasons that had shaped it. And within this process of understanding, the battle was no longer viewed as a sequence of isolated actions, but as a connected series of events influenced by multiple factors that worked together over time. And as the British Eighth Army began to analyze what had taken place, they recognized that their success had not been the result of a single decisive moment, but rather the cumulative effect of coordination, timing, discipline, and adaptability, all functioning together within a structured framework that allowed them to respond effectively to the conditions of the desert. And within this framework, the importance of preparation became increasingly clear, as the ability to enter the battle with A defined plan and a clear understanding of their objectives provided a foundation upon which all subsequent actions were built, and as the engagement unfolded, this preparation allowed the British forces to maintain consistency in their approach, even as the situation evolved, ensuring that their actions remained aligned with their overall strategy. And within this consistency, the role of communication emerged as a central element, as the ability to transmit information accurately and efficiently allowed for a continuous flow of awareness across the formation, enabling units to adjust their actions in response to both immediate conditions and broader developments. And as this communication was maintained, it reinforced the cohesion of the British forces, allowing them to operate as a unified system rather than as a collection of independent units. And within this unity, the concept of adaptability played a crucial role, as the desert environment and the dynamics of the battle required a flexible approach that could respond to changing conditions without losing direction. And as the British forces demonstrated this adaptability, they were able to adjust their movements, refine their tactics, and maintain control over the progression of the engagement. And within this ability to adapt, the role of leadership also became more apparent, as the decisions made at the command level guided the actions of the entire formation, ensuring that each adjustment contributed to the overall objective rather than creating confusion or fragmentation. And as these decisions were implemented through a structured system of communication and coordination, they allowed the British forces to maintain a steady and controlled progression throughout the battle, and within this progression, the contrast with the German forces became increasingly evident, as the challenges faced by their opponent, including fragmentation and reduced cohesion, limited their ability to respond effectively to the evolving situation, and as this contrast developed, it contributed to the gradual shift in momentum that ultimately defined the outcome of the engagement. And within this understanding, the battle began to take on a broader meaning, one that extended beyond the immediate experience and into the principles that had shaped it, illustrating how the integration of multiple elements into a cohesive system could influence the course of an engagement in a decisive and lasting way. As the process of reflection continued and the broader implications of the battle were examined in greater detail, the focus expanded to include not only the factors that had contributed to success, but also the ways in which those factors interacted with one another to create a sustained and cumulative effect. And within this deeper level of analysis, it became clear that the outcome of the battle was shaped by a balance between structure and flexibility, where the British Eighth Army maintained a consistent framework while allowing for the adjustments necessary to respond to changing conditions. And as this balance was maintained, it enabled them to operate with both stability and adaptability, ensuring that their actions remained effective even as the dynamics of the battlefield shifted. And within this balance, the importance of timing once again emerged as a critical element, as the ability to act at the right moment allowed the British forces to maximize the impact of their decisions, reinforcing their control over the engagement and limiting the ability of their opponent to recover or reorganize. And as this control was maintained, it created a sense of continuity within the battle, where each phase built upon the previous one, contributing to a steady and deliberate progression toward the final outcome. And within this progression, the role of cohesion remained central, as the ability of the British forces to operate as a unified system allowed them to maintain alignment across multiple levels of activity, from individual units to the overall command structure. And as this alignment was preserved, it ensured that the actions taken at each level supported and reinforced one another, creating a network of interconnected efforts that extended across the battlefield. And within this network, the limitations faced by the German forces became more apparent, as their reduced cohesion and communication challenges prevented them from maintaining a similar level of integration. And, as a result, their actions became increasingly fragmented, limiting their ability to influence the course of the engagement in a meaningful way. And within this contrast, the advantage held by the British forces was not only maintained, but gradually expanded, as their ability to coordinate and adapt allowed them to shape the battle in accordance with their objectives. And as the engagement reached its conclusion, this accumulated advantage was reflected in the outcome achieved, demonstrating how The interaction of multiple factors, preparation, communication, adaptability, timing, and cohesion, could combine to produce a result that was both decisive and sustainable. And within this understanding, the battle became more than a single event, transforming into a source of insight and learning that would influence future operations and contribute to the ongoing development of military strategy in the desert. And as the British Eighth Army carried these lessons forward, the quiet desert that had witnessed the battle remained unchanged, but the knowledge gained within it continued to shape the actions and decisions of those who had experienced it, ensuring that the significance of the battle extended far beyond its immediate conclusion and into the broader narrative of the campaign as a whole. Chapter 6, Segment 3. The Lessons Carried Forward, What This Battle Meant. As the process of reflection reached its deepest point and the immediate details of the battle began to settle into a more structured understanding, what emerged was not simply a recollection of events, but a collection of lessons that would continue to shape how the British Eighth Army approached future operations. And within this transition from experience to understanding, the battle became something more enduring, a reference point that provided clarity about what had worked, why it had worked, and how those principles could be applied again in different circumstances. And as this understanding developed, the importance of cohesion stood out as one of the most significant elements, as the ability to maintain alignment across multiple levels of activity had allowed the British forces to operate as a unified system, ensuring that each action contributed to the broader objective. And within this cohesion, the role of communication was once again highlighted, as it served as the foundation upon which coordination was built, enabling information to flow continuously and accurately between units and command. And as this flow of information was maintained, it allowed for a level of awareness that supported both decision-making and execution, ensuring that the formation remained responsive to changing conditions while still adhering to its strategic framework. And within this responsiveness, adaptability emerged as another key lesson, as the desert environment and the unpredictable nature of the engagement required a flexible approach that could adjust without losing direction. And as the British forces demonstrated this adaptability, they reinforced the idea that effective strategy is not defined by rigidity, but by the ability to evolve while maintaining a clear sense of purpose. And within this evolution, the role of leadership became increasingly important, as the decisions made at the command level guided the actions of the entire formation, shaping how resources were used, how movements were coordinated, and how challenges were addressed. And as these decisions were implemented through a structured system of communication and coordination, they ensured that the entire formation moved forward with clarity and confidence. And within this clarity, the importance of preparation was also reaffirmed, as the ability to enter the battle with a well-defined plan and a clear understanding of objectives had provided a stable foundation upon which all subsequent actions were built. And as the engagement unfolded, this preparation allowed the British forces to maintain consistency even as they adapted to changing conditions, ensuring that their actions remained aligned with their overall goals. And within this alignment, the cumulative effect of these elements, cohesion, communication, adaptability, leadership, and preparation, became evident as they worked together to create a system that was both effective and resilient, capable of maintaining its integrity under pressure and achieving a decisive outcome. And as these lessons were internalized, they became part of the collective knowledge of the British Eighth Army, influencing not only how future battles would be fought, but how they would be understood and approached from the very beginning. And within this process of learning and adaptation, the significance of the battle extended beyond its immediate context, becoming a source of insight that would continue to shape the development of strategy and practice in the challenging environment of the desert. As these lessons were carried forward and integrated into the ongoing operations of the British Eighth Army, their impact began to extend beyond the individuals who had experienced the battle directly, influencing the broader structure and approach of the formation as a whole. And within this broader influence, the principles that had proven effective in the desert were refined and reinforced, becoming part of a developing framework that would guide future engagements. And as this framework evolved, it emphasized not only the importance of coordination and adaptability, but also the need for continuity, ensuring that the knowledge gained from one engagement could be applied to the next in a consistent and meaningful way. And within this continuity, the role of training and preparation took on new significance, as the lessons learned were translated into practices that could be taught, repeated, and improved upon, allowing the British forces to maintain a high level of readiness and effectiveness as they moved forward. And as this process of integration continued, it created a sense of confidence within the formation, not based on a single victory, but on an understanding of the principles that had made that victory possible. And within this confidence, the ability to face future challenges with clarity and purpose was strengthened, as the British Eighth Army carried with them not only the memory of the battle, but the knowledge of how to approach similar situations in the future. And as the desert remained a constant presence in their operations, its challenges and demands continued to shape their approach, reinforcing the importance of flexibility, awareness, and coordination in an environment that offered little room for error. And within this ongoing interaction between environment and strategy, the lessons of the battle remained relevant, providing a foundation upon which new experiences could be built and understood. And as time passed, the immediate details off. The engagement began to fade, but the underlying principles remained, embedded within the practices and decisions of the formation, guiding their actions in ways that were both subtle and profound. And within this enduring influence, the battle became part of a larger narrative, one that extended beyond individual events and into the broader development of the campaign, illustrating how each engagement contributes to a cumulative process of learning and adaptation. And as the British Eighth Army continued their journey across the desert, the lessons of this battle remained with them, shaping their understanding, informing their decisions, and reinforcing the idea that success is not defined solely by the outcome of a single engagement, but by the ability to learn from that engagement and to carry those lessons forward into the future, ensuring that each experience contributes to a deeper and more effective approach to the challenges that lie ahead. Chapter 7, Segment 1, Beyond the Battlefield: How This Victory Shaped the Campaign. As the immediate aftermath of the battle began to settle into memory and the lessons drawn from it were absorbed into the thinking of the British Eighth Army, a broader perspective slowly came into focus, one that extended beyond the specific engagement and into the wider campaign unfolding across the North African desert. And within this expanding view, the significance of what had been achieved became more clearly defined, not only as a localized success, but as a turning point that influenced the direction and momentum of operations across a much larger scale. And as this understanding developed, it became evident that the battle had altered the balance between opposing forces, shifting the initiative in a way that allowed the British to operate with greater confidence and control. And within this shift, the importance of continuity became apparent, as the success achieved in one engagement created opportunities for subsequent actions, allowing the British forces to build upon their advantage rather than starting anew with each phase of the campaign. And as this continuity was established, it provided a sense of progression, where each step forward was connected to the last, forming a chain of actions that collectively shaped the course of the campaign. And within this progression, the roll-off momentum emerged as a defining factor, as the ability to maintain forward movement and to sustain pressure on the opposing forces limited their capacity to recover and reorganize. And as the British Eighth Army continued to apply the principles that had proven effective in the battle, they reinforced this momentum, ensuring that their actions remained aligned with their broader objectives. And within this alignment, the desert environment itself continued to play a significant role, shaping how operations were conducted and influencing the decisions that guided them. And as the British forces adapted to these conditions, they demonstrated an increasing level of familiarity and control within the environment, allowing them to operate more effectively and with greater precision. And within this growing familiarity, the contrast with the German forces became more pronounced, as the challenges faced by their opponent limited their ability to maintain the same level of cohesion and adaptability. And as this contrast developed, it contributed to a widening gap in effectiveness, reinforcing the advantage held by the British forces and shaping the trajectory of the campaign. And Within this broader context, the battle took on a new significance, not as an isolated event, but as a moment that had influenced the direction of the entire campaign, providing both the foundation and the momentum for the actions that would follow. And as the British Eighth Army moved forward, the impact of this victory remained present, guiding their approach and reinforcing their understanding of how to operate effectively within the challenging and ever-changing conditions of the desert. And within this ongoing progression, the connection between individual engagements and the broader campaign became increasingly clear, illustrating how each battle contributes to a larger narrative, shaping not only immediate outcomes, but the overall direction and development of the conflict as a whole. As the campaign continued to unfold and the influence of the battle became more deeply integrated into the broader operational framework of the British Eighth Army, its impact could be seen in the way subsequent actions were approached, planned, and executed, reflecting a growing confidence in the principles that had proven effective and a clearer understanding of how those principles could be applied in different situations. And within this evolving approach, the importance of consistency became increasingly evident, as the ability to maintain a coherent strategy across multiple engagements allowed the British forces to operate with a level of stability that reinforced their overall effectiveness. And as this consistency was maintained, it created a sense of predictability within their own operations, not in a limiting way, but as a structured foundation that supported adaptability and informed decision-making. And within this structure, the lessons of coordination, communication, and timing continued to play a central role, guiding how units interacted, how information was shared, and how actions were synchronized across the formation. And as these elements were applied repeatedly, they became more refined, contributing to an ongoing process of improvement that enhanced the capability of the British forces over time. And within this process, the relationship between experience and learning became a defining feature, as each engagement provided new insights that were integrated into the existing framework, allowing the British Eighth Army to evolve continuously and to respond more effectively to the challenges they encountered. And as this evolution took place, the broader impact of the battle became more apparent, as it had not only influenced the immediate outcome, but had also shaped the trajectory of the campaign by reinforcing a set of principles that would guide future actions. And within this trajectory, the role of morale also became significant, as the confidence gained from success contributed to a stronger sense of purpose and cohesion within the formation, allowing the British forces to approach subsequent engagements with a greater degree of assurance and clarity. And as this morale was sustained, it further reinforced the effectiveness of their operations, creating a positive cycle where success led to confidence, and confidence supported further success. And within this cycle, the campaign continued to develop in a way that reflected the cumulative impact of individual engagements, illustrating how each battle contributes to a larger and more complex narrative. And as the British Eighth Army continued their advance across the desert, the influence of the earlier battle remained present, not as a static memory, but as an active component of their approach, shaping their decisions, guiding their actions, and reinforcing the understanding that success in such an environment is built upon a combination of experience, learning, and the ability to apply those lessons consistently over time, ensuring that each step forward is supported by the knowledge gained from those that came before. Chapter 7, Segment 2. Pressure that didn't fade, the slow collapse of opposition. As the campaign continued to unfold across the vast and demanding landscape of the North African desert, the effects of the earlier victory did not remain confined to a single moment or location, but instead extended outward in a gradual and persistent manner, shaping the conditions under which future engagements would take place and influencing the capabilities of both sides in ways that became more apparent over time. And within this extended impact, one of the most significant developments was the increasing pressure placed upon the German forces, a pressure that did not manifest as a sudden or dramatic collapse, but rather as a steady and cumulative strain that affected their ability to operate effectively across multiple levels. And as the strain developed, it began to influence not only their movements on the battlefield, but also their capacity to maintain cohesion, communication, and strategic direction, and within this evolving situation, the importance of sustainability became clear, as the ability to continue operating effectively over time depended not only on immediate success, but on the capacity to maintain resources, organization, and morale under increasingly challenging conditions. And as the German forces faced difficulties in sustaining these elements, their effectiveness began to decline in subtle but meaningful ways, and within this decline, the role of disruption became more evident, as the pressure applied by the British Eighth Army limited the ability of their opponent to recover, reorganize, or establish a stable position from which to operate, and as this disruption was maintained, it created a situation where the German forces were continuously responding to external pressures rather than acting with initiative, and within this reactive state, their ability to shape the course of the campaign was significantly reduced, and as a result, the balance of control began to shift more firmly toward the British forces, who were able to maintain a more consistent and proactive approach to their operations, and within this shifting balance, the importance of momentum once again emerged as a defining factor, as the ability of the British Eighth Army to sustain forward movement and continuous pressure reinforced their advantage, ensuring that the effects of their earlier success were not lost, but instead carried forward into subsequent phases of the campaign, and as this momentum was maintained, it contributed to a gradual erosion of the effectiveness of the German forces, not through a single decisive action, but through a series of interconnected developments that collectively limited their capacity to operate at the same level as before. And within this process, the environment itself continued to play a role, as the challenge off the desert amplified the difficulties faced by a force already under strain, making it more difficult to maintain organization, supply, and coordination over extended distances. And as these challenges compounded, they further reduced the ability of the German forces to respond effectively to the ongoing pressure. And within this context, the earlier battle could be seen not only as a moment of success, but as the beginning of a broader shift, one that set in motion a series of developments that would continue to influence the campaign long after the immediate engagement had ended, illustrating how the effects of a single battle can extend far beyond its immediate outcome, shaping the conditions and possibilities of future actions in ways that are both gradual and profound. As the cumulative effects of this sustained pressure continued to shape the campaign, the limitations faced by the German forces became increasingly difficult to overcome, not because of any single failure, but because of the way in which multiple challenges interacted and reinforced one another over time, creating a situation where recovery became progressively more difficult, and within this environment, the concept of cumulative disadvantage began to take form, as each setback, no matter how small, contributed to a broader pattern that gradually reduced the overall effectiveness of the formation. And as this pattern developed, it influenced not only the physical aspects of the campaign, such as movement and positioning, but also the more intangible elements, including confidence, coordination, and the ability to make effective decisions under pressure. And within this interplay of factors, the contrast between the two sides became more pronounced, as the British Eighth Army continued to build upon their earlier success, reinforcing their structure, refining their approach, and maintaining a level of cohesion that allowed them to operate with clarity and purpose. And as this contrast deepened, it created a widening gap in capability, one that made it increasingly difficult for the German forces to respond in a way that could alter the overall direction of the campaign. And within this widening gap, the role of continuity once again became significant, as the British forces were able to sustain their approach across multiple engagements, ensuring that each action contributed to a broader and more consistent strategy, while their opponents struggled to maintain a similar level of coherence. And as a result, the campaign began to take on a more defined trajectory, one that reflected the cumulative impact of sustained pressure, effective coordination, and the ability to adapt over time. And within this trajectory, the earlier battle remained a key reference point, not because it alone determined the outcome of the campaign, but because it initiated a sequence of developments that would continue to unfold in the weeks and months that followed, shaping the conditions under which future engagements would take place. and influencing the decisions and actions of both sides in ways that were often subtle but consistently meaningful. And as the British Eighth Army continued their advance, the effects of this sustained pressure were reflected in the changing nature of the campaign. Where opportunities became more frequent, resistance became less coordinated, and the ability to maintain control over the progression of events became more firmly established. And within this evolving situation, the importance of persistence became clear, as the ability to apply continuous and consistent pressure over time proved to be just as significant as the success achieved in individual engagements, illustrating how the outcome of a campaign is shaped not only by decisive moments, but by the accumulation of actions that reinforce and sustain those moments, ensuring that their impact extends far beyond their initial occurrence and contributes to a broader and more enduring shift in the balance of the conflict. Chapter 7, Segment 3. A turning point in the desert, how this moment echoed beyond. As the campaign continued to unfold across the vast expanse of North Africa, and the immediate effects of sustained pressure became part of a broader and more stable pattern, the significance of the earlier battle began to extend even further, reaching beyond the immediate operational environment and influencing how the Desert War itself was understood within the wider context of the conflict. And within this expanded perspective, the battle came to be seen not merely as one engagement among many, but as a moment that contributed to a larger shift in momentum, one that altered the expectations, strategies, and possibilities for both sides in ways that were not immediately visible at the time but became clearer as the campaign progressed. And as this understanding developed, it became evident that the impact of the battle was not confined to the physical outcomes on the battlefield, but also included the psychological and strategic dimensions that shaped how future operations would be approached. And within this broader influence, the role of confidence emerged as a key factor, as the success achieved by the British Eighth Army reinforced their belief in their methods, their coordination, and their ability to operate effectively within the challenging conditions of the desert. And as this confidence grew, it translated into a more assured and proactive approach to subsequent engagements, allowing the British forces to take initiative and to shape the course of events with greater clarity and purpose. And within this shift in approach, the importance of perception also became apparent, as the way in which the battle was understood by both sides influenced their expectations and decisions moving forward. And as the British forces viewed the battle as confirmation of their effectiveness, the German forces were faced with the challenge of reassessing their own approach, often under conditions that made such reassessment difficult to implement. And within this imbalance, the strategic implications of the battle became more pronounced, as the ability to maintain initiative and to operate with confidence provided the British forces with an advantage that extended beyond any single engagement. And as this advantage was sustained over time, it contributed to a broader shift in the dynamics of the campaign, where the balance of control increasingly favored the British side. And within this shifting dynamic, the desert itself remained a constant presence, its vast and unforgiving landscape continuing to shape the conditions under which operations were conducted. But as the British forces adapted more effectively to these conditions, they were able to turn what had once been a challenge into an environment in which they could operate with increasing efficiency and control. And as this transformation took place, it further reinforced the significance of the earlier battle, illustrating how a single moment of success can contribute to a broader process of adaptation and improvement, shaping not only the immediate outcome, but the trajectory of future actions. And within this trajectory, the battle became part of a larger narrative, one that connected individual engagements into a continuous and evolving story of the Desert War, where each event contributed to the overall direction and development of the conflict. And as this narrative continued to unfold, the echoes of that earlier moment remained present, influencing decisions, shaping expectations, and reinforcing the understanding that success in such an environment is not defined by isolated victories, but by the ability to build upon them, to carry their lessons forward, and to integrate them into a broader and more effective approach to the challenges that lie ahead. As the campaign moved forward and the broader implications of the battle continued to unfold, its influence became increasingly integrated into the larger structure of the war itself, extending beyond the immediate theater of operations and contributing to a wider understanding of how momentum, coordination, and sustained pressure could shape the outcome of complex and interconnected conflicts. And within this expanded context, the battle served as an example of how localized success can influence broader strategic considerations, providing insights that could be applied in different regions and under different conditions. And as this example was observed and analyzed, it reinforced the importance of maintaining a balance between planning and adaptability, illustrating how a structured approach, when combined with the ability to respond to changing circumstances, can create a level of effectiveness that extends beyond individual engagements. And within this understanding, the role of continuity once again became significant, as the ability to carry lessons forward and to apply them consistently across multiple phases of the campaign ensured that the impact of the battle was not lost, but instead amplified over time. And as this amplification occurred, it contributed to a broader shift in how the Desert War was conducted, influencing not only the actions of the British Eighth Army, but also the expectations and strategies of other forces involved in the conflict. And within this wider influence, the importance of integration became clear, as the ability to connect individual actions into a cohesive and coordinated whole allowed for a level of effectiveness that could shape the direction of the campaign in a meaningful way. And as this integration was maintained, it created a sense of progression, where each engagement built upon the last, contributing to a cumulative process that gradually shifted the balance of the conflict. And within this process, the earlier battle remained a key point of reference, not because it alone determined the outcome, but because it demonstrated how a combination of preparation, coordination, and adaptability could be applied successfully in a challenging environment, providing a model that could be refined and expanded upon in future operations. And as this model was carried forward, it continued to influence the actions and decisions of the British forces, ensuring that the lessons of the battle remained active and relevant. And as the Desert Campaign moved toward its later stages, the significance of this moment became even more apparent, as the cumulative effects of sustained pressure, effective coordination, and continuous learning began to shape the overall trajectory of the war in the region, illustrating how individual engagements, when understood and applied effectively, can contribute to a broader and more enduring shift in the balance of a conflict. And within this larger narrative, the battle became more than a single event, transforming into a lasting example of how success is built not only through action, but through the ability to understand, adapt, and carry forward the lessons of that action into the future, ensuring that each moment of progress contributes to a greater and more sustained outcome over time. Chapter 8, Segment 1. The Men Who Fought What They Carried with Them. As the wider campaign continued to evolve and the strategic consequences of the battle became more clearly defined, there remained another dimension of the experience that unfolded more quietly, away from the movement of formations and the decisions of command, a dimension shaped by the individuals who had taken part in the engagement and who now carried with them the memory of what had occurred. And within this more personal layer of the aftermath, the transition from action to stillness took on a different meaning, one that was not defined by the desert landscape or the positioning of units, but by the internal process of reflection that began once the immediate demands of the battlefield had passed. And as the soldiers of the British Eighth Army found themselves in this quieter state, their awareness shifted from the external environment to a more inward perspective, where the events of the battle could be revisited, not in the urgency of the moment, but in the calm that followed. And within this process, the details of the engagement often remained vivid, the movements, the sounds, the rhythm of action and response, all forming a continuous thread that connected the present moment to what had taken place before. And as these memories were recalled, they did not exist in isolation, but as part of a broader understanding of the experience, shaped by both individual perception and the shared reality of those who had been there, and within this shared reality, a sense of connection emerged as the soldiers recognized that their experience was not theirs alone, but part of a collective moment that had been lived together. And as this connection was acknowledged, it contributed to a deeper sense of cohesion, one that extended beyond the structural coordination of the battlefield and into the realm of shared understanding. And within this cohesion, the experience of the battle became something that could be carried forward, not only as memory, but as a form of knowledge that informed how each individual understood their role and their place within the larger formation. And as this understanding developed, it influenced how they approached the continuation of the campaign, providing a sense of continuity that linked past actions to future expectations. And within this continuity, the human experience of the battle took on a lasting significance, as it shaped not only how the soldiers viewed the events that had occurred, but also how they prepared themselves for what lay ahead. And as the desert remained unchanged in its outward appearance, the internal landscape of those who had fought within it continued to evolve, reflecting the complexity of an experience that combined action, observation, and reflection into a single and enduring memory. And within this evolving perspective, the battle became more than a moment in time, transforming into a lasting part of the individual and collective identity of the British Eighth Army, one that would continue to influence their understanding, their decisions, and their actions as the campaign moved forward, ensuring that the experience of the battle remained present not only in what had been achieved, but in how it was remembered and carried forward into the future. As the days passed and the immediate intensity of the battle receded further into the background, the process of reflection continued to deepen, allowing the soldiers to engage with their experiences in a more measured and thoughtful way. And within this extended period of calm, the memories of the battle began to settle into a more stable form, no longer defined solely by the urgency of the moment, but by the meaning that could be drawn from them. And as this meaning was explored, it often revealed a balance between the external events of the engagement and the internal responses they had evoked, creating a layered understanding that combined action with reflection. And within this layered understanding, the role of routine began to reemerge, as the soldiers returned to the structured patterns of daily life within the army. And as these routines were established, they provided a sense of stability that helped to anchor the experience of the battle within a broader context, allowing it to be integrated into the ongoing flow of the campaign rather than remaining as an isolated or overwhelming event. And within this integration, the importance of continuity once again became evident, as the ability to move forward while carrying the lessons of the past ensured that the experience of the battle contributed to the overall development of the formation, rather than remaining confined to a single moment. And as this process continued, the shared nature of the experience played a significant role, as conversations, observations, and the simple presence of others who had been through the same events created a sense of understanding that did not always need to be expressed in words. And within this shared understanding, the cohesion of the formation was reinforced at a deeper level, extending beyond the structural coordination of the battlefield into the realm of human connection. And as this connection was maintained, it contributed to the resilience of the soldiers, allowing them to carry forward the experience of the battle without being defined solely by it. And within this resilience, the importance of perspective also became clear, as the ability to view the battle within the broader context of the campaign allowed the soldiers to understand its significance without losing sight of what remained to be done. And as this perspective was developed, it helped to shape a balanced understanding of the experience, one that acknowledged both its intensity and its place within a larger and ongoing process. And within this balance, the human dimension of the battle remained present, not as a separate element, but as an integral part of the overall narrative, illustrating how the experiences of individuals contribute to the broader story of the campaign. And as the British Eighth Army continued their journey across the desert, the memories of the battle remained with them, shaping their understanding, informing their actions, and reinforcing the connection between past experience and future possibility, ensuring that the human side of the engagement remained a central and enduring part of its legacy. Chapter 8, Segment 2, Endurance Beyond the Battle, Living with What Remains. As the immediate memories of the battle settled into a quieter and more distant part of the soldier's awareness, another layer of experience began to take shape, one that was less visible but equally significant, defined not by what had happened during the engagement itself, but by how those experiences continued to exist within the individuals who had lived through them. And within this more subtle phase, endurance took on a different meaning, shifting from the physical demands of movement and action to a quieter, more internal form of resilience, where the challenge was not to react to immediate danger, but to carry forward the memory of that danger while continuing to function within the structured routine of the army. And as the soldiers of the British Eighth Army returned to their daily responsibilities, this balance between past and present became an essential part of their experience, as the rhythm of routine provided a sense of stability, while the memory of the battle remained present in ways that were often quiet and understated. And within this balance, the process of adaptation continued, not in response to changing conditions on the battlefield, but in response to the internal shifts that followed the experience of intense and sustained action. And as this adaptation unfolded, it revealed the capacity of individuals to integrate complex experiences into their understanding of themselves and their role within the larger formation. And within this integration, the importance of continuity once again became evident, as the ability to maintain focus on the tasks ahead allowed the soldiers to move forward without becoming overwhelmed by what had already occurred. And as this forward movement was sustained, it created a sense of progression that linked past experiences to future actions, ensuring that the memory of the battle contributed to a broader and more ongoing process of development rather than remaining fixed in a single moment. And within this process, the Rollioff shared experience continued to provide a foundation for understanding, as the presence of others who had faced the same conditions created a sense of connection that did not rely on explanation, but on recognition. And as this recognition was maintained, it reinforced the cohesion of the formation at a deeper level, extending beyond the structural coordination of the battlefield into the realm of human resilience. And within this resilience, the ability to maintain clarity and purpose became a defining feature, as the soldiers continued to carry out their roles with the same level of discipline and focus that had guided them through the battle, demonstrating that endurance is not only about withstanding difficulty, but about continuing to move forward with intention and awareness. And as the desert remained vast and unchanged around them, this internal process of endurance unfolded quietly, shaping how each individual understood their experience and how they prepared themselves for what lay ahead. And within this quiet transformation, the true depth of the human experience of the battle became more apparent, illustrating that what remains after an engagement is not only the outcome, but the lasting impact it has on those who lived through it, an impact that continues to evolve over time, influencing how they think, act, and move forward within the ongoing journey of the campaign. As this quieter form of endurance continued to develop over time, it began to influence not only the internal experience of the soldiers, but also the way in which they interacted with their environment, their responsibilities, and one another, creating a subtle but meaningful shift in the overall atmosphere of the formation. And within this shift, the concept of resilience became more clearly defined, not as a dramatic or visible quality, but as a steady and consistent ability to maintain balance in the face of ongoing challenges. And as the British Eighth Army continued their operations, this resilience was reflected in the way routines were maintained, decisions were carried out, and relationships between individuals remained stable and supportive, even as the demands of the campaign persisted. And within this stability, the importance of structure once again became evident, as the familiar patterns of daily life provided a framework within which the experience of the battle could be understood and integrated, allowing it to become part of a larger and more continuous narrative rather than a separate or isolated event. And as this integration took place, the memory of the battle began to shift from something immediate and intense to something more reflective and contextual, a part of the past that continued to inform the present without dominating it. And within this transformation, the role of perspective became increasingly important, as the ability to view the battle within the broader scope of the campaign allowed the soldiers to understand its significance while also recognizing the importance of what remained to be done. And as this perspective was maintained, it contributed to a sense of purpose that extended beyond any single engagement, reinforcing the idea that each experience, no matter how intense, is part of a larger journey that continues forward, and within this journey, the connection between individuals remained a central element, as the shared experience of the battle created a bond that supported not only understanding, but also the ability to move forward together, and as this bond was sustained, it contributed to the overall strength of the formation, ensuring that the human dimension of the Army remained as cohesive and resilient as its structural and operational aspects. And within this cohesion, the lessons of the battle continued to resonate, not only as strategic insights, but as personal experiences that shaped how each individual approached their role and their responsibilities, and as the desert stretched out before them, unchanged in its vastness and complexity, the soldiers carried with them not only the memory of what had occurred, but the understanding that they could endure, adapt, and continue, ensuring that the impact of the battle was not something that held them back, but something that contributed to their ability to face whatever challenges lay ahead with a steady and grounded sense of awareness. And within this ongoing process, the true meaning of endurance revealed itself, not as a moment of strength, but as a continuous and evolving capacity to carry forward the past while remaining fully present in the journey ahead. Chapter 8, Segment 3, Memory and Meaning: How the Battle Lived On. As time continued to move forward and the distance between the present moment and the events of the battle gradually increased, the experience itself began to take on a different form, shifting from something immediate and lived into something remembered and understood. And within this transformation, memory became the primary way in which the battle continued to exist, not as a fixed or unchanging record, but as a living process that evolved alongside the individuals who carried it. And as the soldiers of the British Eighth Army reflected on what they had experienced, their memories were shaped not only by the events themselves, but by the context in which they were recalled, influenced by the passage of time, the continuation of the campaign, and the ongoing interaction between past and present. And within this evolving process, the battle began to take on layers of meaning, each one adding depth to the understanding of what had occurred and why it mattered. And as these layers developed, they revealed that the significance of the battle extended beyond its immediate outcome, encompassing not only the actions that had been taken, but also the lessons that had been learned and the changes that had followed. And within this broader understanding, the role of reflection became central, as the ability to revisit the experience with a calmer and more measured perspective allowed the soldiers to interpret it in ways that were not possible in the moment itself. And as this reflection unfolded, it often highlighted the connections between individual actions and the larger structure of the engagement, illustrating how each movement, each decision, and each response contributed to the overall outcome. And within this awareness, a deeper appreciation of coordination and cohesion emerged, reinforcing the idea that the success of the battle had been the result of a collective effort rather than isolated actions. And as this appreciation grew, it contributed to a sense of meaning that extended beyond personal experience, connecting individual memories to the shared narrative of the formation. And within this shared narrative, the battle became part of a larger story, one that continued to develop as the campaign progressed. And as this story unfolded, the memory of the battle remained present as a reference point, shaping how future events were understood and interpreted. And within this ongoing process, the relationship between memory and identity became more apparent, as the experience of the battle influenced how the soldiers saw themselves and their role within the army, contributing to a sense of continuity that linked past actions to present responsibilities. And as this sense of continuity was maintained, it ensured that the memory of the battle was not something separate from the ongoing experience of the campaign, but an integral part of it, shaping both understanding and action in subtle but meaningful ways. And within this integration, the true depth of the battle's impact became clear, illustrating that what remains after an engagement is not only the outcome that can be observed, but the meaning that is carried forward, evolving over time and continuing to influence how the experience is remembered and understood. As this process of remembering and understanding continued to unfold, the memory of the battle began to settle into a more enduring form, one that was less defined by individual details and more by the overall sense of what had been experienced and achieved. And within this more stable form, the battle became part of a collective memory, shared across the formation and reinforced through conversations, observations, and the simple acknowledgement of a moment that had been lived together. And as this collective memory developed, it created a sense of continuity that extended beyond individual experiences, linking each soldier to a broader narrative that encompassed both the past and the present. And within this narrative, the significance of the battle was not only preserved, but also contextualized, allowing it to be understood as part of a larger and ongoing process rather than as a single and isolated event. And as this understanding deepened, it contributed to a more balanced perspective, one that recognized both the intensity of the experience and its place within the wider campaign. And within this balance, the roll-off meaning became increasingly important, as the ability to interpret the battle in a way that connected it to broader goals and outcomes provided a sense of purpose that extended beyond the immediate experience. And as this sense of purpose was maintained, it helped to anchor the memory of the battle within a framework that supported both reflection and forward movement, ensuring that it remained a source of insight rather than something that limited or constrained the present. And within this framework, the relationship between past and future became more clearly defined, as the lessons and experiences of the battle were carried forward into new situations, influencing decisions and actions in ways that were often subtle but consistently meaningful. And as this influence continued, it reinforced the idea that memory is not static, but an active and evolving part of the human experience, shaping how individuals understand their past and how they approach their future. And within this ongoing evolution, the battle remained present not as a fixed point in time, but as a dynamic and integrated part of the journey, contributing to a deeper and more comprehensive understanding of both the individual and the collective experience of the campaign. And as the British Eighth Army continued their advance across the desert, the memory of the battle remained with them not as something that needed to be revisited constantly, but as something that had become part of who they were, influencing their perspective, reinforcing their resilience, and ensuring that the experience of the battle continued to have meaning long after the immediate events had passed, shaping not only how it was remembered, but how it was carried forward into the future. Chapter 9, Segment 1. From Moment to Legacy: How One Battle Endured. As the passage of time carried the events of the battle further into the past and the immediate urgency of the campaign gradually gave way to a broader and more reflective understanding, the nature of the battle itself began to shift once again, transforming from an experience that had been lived into one that would be remembered, studied, and interpreted within a larger historical context. And within this transformation, the concept of legacy began to take shape, not as something defined by a single outcome or a simple measure of success, but as a complex and evolving understanding of what the battle had meant and how it continued to influence the events that followed. And as this understanding developed, it became clear that the legacy of the battle was built upon multiple layers, each contributing to a more complete picture of its significance. And within these layers, the immediate outcome of the engagement remained an important starting point, as it provided the foundation upon which all further interpretation was based. But as the perspective widened, it also became evident that the true importance of the battle extended beyond this initial result, encompassing the processes, decisions, and experiences that had shaped it. And within this broader view, the role of continuity once again emerged as a defining element, as the effects of the battle did not end with its conclusion, but instead carried forward into subsequent actions, influencing the direction of the campaign and contributing to a larger pattern of development that extended across time. And as this continuity was recognized, it allowed the battle to be understood not as an isolated moment, but as part of a sequence of events that were interconnected and mutually influential. And within this sequence, the lessons of coordination, adaptability, and sustained effort continued to resonate, providing a framework through which the battle could be interpreted and understood. And as these lessons were applied and refined in later engagements, they reinforced the significance of the earlier experience, illustrating how knowledge gained in one context can be carried forward and adapted to new situations. And within this process, the role of memory and interpretation became increasingly important, as the way in which the battle was remembered influenced how it was understood and how its lessons were applied. And as this interpretation evolved over time, it reflected not only the events themselves, but also the changing perspectives of those who studied and reflected upon them. And within this evolving understanding, the battle began to take on a more enduring presence, one that extended beyond the individuals who had experienced it and into the broader narrative of the war. And as this presence was established, it contributed to a sense of continuity that linked past events to present understanding, ensuring that the legacy of the battle remained active and relevant, shaping how it was remembered and how it continued to influence the development of strategy, thought, and historical perspective in the years that followed. And within this enduring legacy, the battle became more than a moment in time, transforming into a point of reference that would continue to inform and guide understanding long after the desert itself had returned to silence. As the legacy of the battle continued to develop and its place within the broader narrative of the war became more clearly defined, it began to influence not only how the past was understood, but also how future actions were approached and interpreted, creating a connection between history and ongoing experience that reinforced the relevance of what had occurred. And within this connection, the battle served as both a reference and a guide, providing insights into the principles and practices that had proven effective and illustrating how those principles could be adapted to different circumstances. And as this role became more established, the importance of interpretation grew, as historians, commanders, and those who had experienced the battle themselves contributed to a collective understanding that was shaped by multiple perspectives, each adding depth and nuance to the overall picture. And within this collective understanding, the balance between detail and meaning became a central consideration, as the specific actions and events of the battle were examined not only for their immediate significance, but for what they revealed about the broader dynamics of the campaign. And as this examination continued, it reinforced the idea that the legacy of a battle is not defined solely by what happened, but by how it is understood, remembered, and applied in the context of future developments. And within this ongoing process, the role of continuity remained essential, as the ability to connect past experiences to present and future actions ensured that the lessons of the battle remained active and influential, rather than becoming static or disconnected from the realities of ongoing operations. And as this continuity was maintained, it contributed to a deeper and more integrated understanding of the campaign as a whole, illustrating how individual engagements are linked together through a process of learning, adaptation, and application that extends across time. And within this integrated understanding, the significance of the battle became more fully realized, not as an isolated achievement, but as part of a larger and more complex narrative that encompassed both the immediate experience and its lasting impact. And as this narrative continued to evolve, the battle remained a central element within it, shaping how the campaign was understood and remembered, and providing a foundation upon which further insights and interpretations could be built. And within this enduring influence, the battle demonstrated how a single moment, when understood in its full context, can contribute to a broader and more meaningful understanding of a conflict, ensuring that its legacy continues to resonate long after the events themselves have passed. And as this resonance carried forward, it reinforced the idea that history is not simply a record of what has occurred, but a dynamic and evolving process through which the past continues to inform and shape the present and the future. Chapter 9, Segment 2. Studying the battle, how history understands it. As the events of the battle moved further into the realm of history and the immediate experience gave way to analysis and interpretation, a new phase of understanding began to take shape, one that focused not on the urgency of action or the intensity of experience, but on the careful examination of what had occurred and the effort to place those events within a broader and more structured framework. And within this process, the battle became an object of study, approached from multiple perspectives, that sought to understand not only what happened, but why it happened and how its outcomes were shaped by the interaction of various elements. and as this analytical approach developed, it revealed the complexity of the engagement, illustrating that the battle was not the result of a single factor, but of a combination of decisions, conditions, and actions that interacted over time to produce a specific outcome. And within this complexity, the role of structure became particularly important, as historians and analysts sought to organize the events of the battle into a coherent narrative that could be understood and communicated, and as this narrative was constructed, it provided a way to connect individual moments into a larger sequence, allowing for a clearer understanding of how the engagement unfolded and how its different phases were related to one another. And within this structured narrative, the importance of perspective became increasingly evident, as different observers brought different interpretations to the same set of events, each highlighting particular aspects while placing less emphasis on others. And as these perspectives were compared and integrated, they contributed to a more nuanced and comprehensive understanding of the battle, one that acknowledged both its immediate dynamics and its broader implications. And within this process of interpretation, the role of evidence also became central, as the analysis relied on records, accounts, and observations that provided insight into the actions and decisions that had shaped the engagement. And as this evidence was examined, it allowed for a deeper exploration of the factors that had contributed to the outcome, including the role of coordination, communication, timing, and adaptability, all of which had been identified as key elements during the battle itself. And as these factors were studied in greater detail, they reinforced the understanding that success in such an environment isn't the result of chance, but of a structured and integrated approach that aligns multiple elements toward a common objective. And within this reinforced understanding, the battle began to take on a more defined place within the study of military history, serving as an example of how complex engagements can be analyzed and understood through a combination of narrative, evidence, and interpretation. And as this place was established, it contributed to the broader effort to understand the nature of conflict and the principles that govern it, ensuring that the lessons of the battle remained accessible and relevant to those who sought to learn from it. And within this ongoing process of study, the battle continued to evolve, not in its events but in its interpretation, reflecting the dynamic nature of historical understanding and the continuous effort to deepen and refine the way in which the past is perceived and explained. As the analytical process continued and the study of the battle became more detailed and refined, it also began to influence how the engagement was taught, discussed, and applied within broader frameworks of military thought and historical understanding, creating a bridge between the specific events of the past and the general principles that could be derived from them. And within this bridge, the role of abstraction became important, as the detailed events of the battle were translated into broader concepts that could be understood and applied in different contexts, allowing the lessons of the engagement to extend beyond its immediate circumstances. And as this translation took place, it highlighted the importance of identifying patterns within the complexity of the battle, recognizing how certain elements, such as coordination, adaptability, and sustained pressure, interacted to produce a specific outcome. And as these patterns were identified, they provided a framework through which similar situations could be approached, reinforcing the idea that the study of history is not only about understanding the past, but about applying that understanding to future challenges. And within this application, the role of interpretation remained central, as the way in which the battle was understood influenced how its lessons were applied, and as different perspectives were considered, they contributed to a more flexible and comprehensive approach, allowing for a deeper and more adaptable understanding of the principles involved. And within this evolving framework, the battle continued to serve as a point-of reference, illustrating how theory and practice intersect, and how the outcomes of real engagements can inform and refine broader concepts. And as this interaction between theory and practice developed, it reinforced the importance of maintaining a connection between detailed analysis and broader understanding, ensuring that the lessons of the battle remained grounded in the realities of the experience while also contributing to a more general and applicable body of knowledge. And within this balance, the study of the battle became an ongoing process, one that did not reach a fixed conclusion, but continued to evolve as new perspectives, insights, and interpretations were introduced, reflecting the dynamic nature of historical inquiry and the continuous effort to deepen our understanding of the past. And as this process continued, the battle remained a central example. Within this broader effort, demonstrating how a single engagement, when carefully examined and thoughtfully interpreted, can contribute to a deeper and more meaningful understanding of conflict, strategy, and the complex interplay of factors that shape the outcomes of human action in challenging and dynamic environments, ensuring that its significance endures not only as a historical event, but as a source of insight and learning that continues to inform and inspire future generations. Chapter 9, Segment 3, The Enduring Legacy: What This Battle Came to Represent. As the battle continued to move further into the past and its place within the broader history of the war became more firmly established, its significance began to take on a more symbolic dimension, one that extended beyond the specific details of the engagement and into the realm of what it came to represent. And within this symbolic understanding, the battle was no longer viewed solely as a sequence of actions or a particular outcome, but as an example of how certain principles, when applied effectively, can shape the course of events in meaningful and lasting ways. And as this perspective developed, it allowed the battle to be understood not only in terms of what happened, but in terms of what it demonstrated, illustrating the importance of coordination, adaptability, and sustained effort in overcoming complex challenges. And within this demonstration, the role of integration became particularly important, as the success of the British Eighth Army was not the result of any single factor, but of the way in which multiple elements were brought together into a cohesive and functional system. And as this integration was recognized, it reinforced the idea that effectiveness in such environments depends on the ability to align different aspects of action and understanding into a unified whole. And within this alignment, the concept of balance also emerged as a key theme, as the British forces were able to maintain a structured approach while remaining flexible enough to respond to changing conditions, illustrating how stability and adaptability can coexist and support one another when properly managed. And as these themes were identified and reflected upon, they contributed to a deeper and more enduring understanding of the battle, one that extended beyond its immediate context and into the broader study of strategy and human action. And within this broader understanding, the battle became a point of reference, a moment that could be revisited and reconsidered as new questions and perspectives emerged, allowing its significance to evolve over time rather than remaining fixed. And as this evolution continued, it ensured that the legacy of the battle remained active and relevant, capable of contributing to ongoing discussions and interpretations that sought to understand the nature of conflict and the factors that influence its outcomes. And within this ongoing relevance, the battle also became part of a larger narrative, one that connected individual engagements into a continuous and developing story of the campaign, illustrating how each moment contributes to a broader and more complex process. And as this narrative was constructed and refined, the battle's role within it became more clearly defined, not as an isolated event, but as a significant and influential part of a larger whole. And within this context, its legacy was shaped not only by what it had achieved, but by how it was understood and applied in the years that followed, ensuring that its impact extended beyond the desert in which it was fought and into the broader understanding of the war itself. As this symbolic and analytical understanding of the battle continued to develop, it also began to influence the way in which the engagement was remembered and communicated to future generations, shaping how its story was told and how its lessons were conveyed. And within this process of transmission, the balance between detail and meaning once again became important, as these specific events of the battle were preserved not only for their own sake, but as a means of illustrating broader principles and insights. And as this balance was maintained, it allowed the battle to be both understood and appreciated in multiple ways, providing a foundation for both detailed study and more general reflection. And within this dual role, the battle's legacy became more accessible, extending beyond those who had experienced it directly and into a wider audience that could engage with its significance through the narratives and interpretations that had been developed over time. and as this wider engagement took place, it contributed to a collective understanding that continued to evolve, shaped by new perspectives and informed by ongoing analysis, ensuring that the legacy of the battle remained dynamic rather than static. And within this dynamic understanding, the importance of continuity once again became clear, as the ability to connect past experiences to present and future contexts allowed the lessons of the battle to remain relevant and meaningful, even as the circumstances in which they were applied changed, and as this continuity was maintained, it reinforced the idea that history is not a fixed record, but an ongoing conversation, one that is shaped by the interaction between past events and present understanding. And within this conversation, the battle continued to hold a significant place, serving as both an example and a point of reference that could be revisited and reinterpreted as new questions and insights emerged. And as this process continued, it ensured that the legacy of the battle remained active, contributing to a deeper and more comprehensive understanding of both the specific engagement and the broader dynamics of the war. And within this enduring influence, the battle demonstrated how a single moment, when examined and understood in its full complexity, can continue to resonate across time, shaping not only how it is remembered, but how it informs and guides the understanding of future generations, ensuring that its significance remains both meaningful and enduring long after the immediate events have passed. Chapter 10, Segment 1. The Final Reflection, Returning to the Desert. As the narrative of the battle reaches its final stages and the layers of action, experience, and reflection begin to settle into a unified understanding, the focus gently returns to the place where it all unfolded, the vast and quiet desert that has remained constant throughout the entire story. And within this return, there is a sense of stillness that contrasts with the intensity that once filled the landscape, as the movements of vehicles, the coordination of units, and the urgency of decisions have all faded, leaving behind a space that appears unchanged yet carries the subtle imprint of what has occurred. And as this stillness is observed, it invites a final reflection, not on the events of the battle, but on the broader journey that has been traced through each chapter, from the initial moments of preparation and movement to the deeper layers of human experience and lasting legacy. And within this reflection, the desert becomes more than a setting, transforming into a quiet witness to the unfolding of events, a place where action and stillness coexist across time. And as this perspective is embraced, it allows for a more complete understanding of the battle, one that acknowledges both its immediate reality and its enduring significance. And within this understanding, the connection between past and present becomes more apparent, as the quiet desert of the present moment holds within it the memory of the past, not in a visible or dramatic way, but in the subtle awareness of what has taken place. And as this awareness is considered, it brings together the various elements that have shaped the narrative, including the coordination of the British Eighth Army, the challenges of the environment, and the experiences of the individuals who took part in the engagement. And within this convergence, the meaning of the battle becomes clearer, not as a single definition, but as a layered and evolving understanding that reflects the complexity of the events and the perspectives through which they are viewed. And as this layered meaning is explored, it reinforces the idea that the significance of the battle lies not only in what happened, but in how it is understood, remembered, and carried forward. And within this broader perspective, the narrative reaches a point of calm, where the urgency of action gives way to a more reflective and contemplative state, allowing the full scope of the experience to be considered in a balanced and thoughtful way. And as this reflection continues, it highlights the continuity that has connected each stage of the journey, illustrating how the events of the battle, the lessons that were drawn from it, and the legacy that has followed are all part of a single and ongoing process, one that extends beyond the boundaries of time and place. And within this ongoing process, the desert remains quiet and unchanged, serving as a reminder that while the events of the battle have passed, their meaning continues to evolve, carried forward in the understanding of those who reflect upon them. And as the narrative gently settles into this final perspective, it invites a sense of closure that is not defined by an ending, but by a deeper awareness of the journey that has taken place and the insights that have been gained along the way. As this final reflection deepens and the narrative draws closer to its conclusion, the focus shifts from the specific details of the battle to the broader sense of understanding that has emerged from it, allowing the experience to be seen as part of a larger and more continuous flow of events. And within this broader view, the desert once again serves as a central point of reference, not as a place of action, but as a space of quiet continuity, where the passage of time is marked not by visible change, but by the subtle accumulation of memory and meaning. And as this perspective is embraced, it creates a sense of balance between what has been and what remains, allowing the history of the battle to settle into a form that is both complete and open to further reflection. And within this balance, the various elements of the narrative come together in a cohesive way, connecting the experiences of the individuals, the actions of the formation, and the broader implications of the engagement, into a unified understanding that reflects the complexity and depth of the events that have been explored. And as this understanding takes shape, it reinforces the idea that the significance of the battle lies not only in its immediate outcome, but in the way it continues to influence thought, perspective, and understanding over time. And within this ongoing influence, the lessons of coordination, adaptability, and resilience remain present, not as abstract concepts, but as lived experiences that have been carried forward and integrated into the broader narrative. And as these lessons are considered within the context of the desert, they take on a quieter and more reflective quality, illustrating how the intensity of action can give way to a deeper and more lasting form of understanding. And within this transition, the narrative reaches a point where it no longer needs to move forward in the same way, as the journey itself has provided the insight and perspective that were sought. And as this realization settles in, it allows for a sense of completion that is both calm and meaningful, acknowledging the path that has been taken while also recognizing that the understanding gained from it continues to extend beyond the boundaries of the story. And within this sense of completion, the desert remains as it has always been, vast, quiet, and unchanged, holding within it the memory of the events that have unfolded and the meaning that has been drawn from them. And as the narrative gently comes to rest within this space, it leaves behind not a conclusion in the traditional sense, but a lasting impression, one that invites continued reflection and understanding, ensuring that the story of the battle remains present not only in what has been told, but in how it is remembered and carried forward into the future. Chapter 10, Segment 2. The Meaning of Victory Beyond Numbers and Outcomes. As the narrative settles further into its final phase and the events of the battle are no longer viewed through the lens of movement or immediate consequence, a quieter and more thoughtful question begins to emerge, one that reaches beyond the visible results and into the deeper meaning of what has been achieved. And within this question lies the idea of victory, not simply as a measurable outcome defined by positions gained or losses inflicted, but as a broader and more layered concept that reflects the interaction of effort, understanding, and continuity over time. And as this idea is explored, it becomes clear that victory in this context cannot be reduced to a single moment or a single result, but must instead be understood as part of an ongoing process, one that begins with preparation, unfolds through action, and continues through reflection and application. And within this process, the role of the British Eighth Army can be seen not only in what they accomplished during the battle, but in how they approached it, the discipline they maintained, the coordination they achieved, and the adaptability they demonstrated in response to changing conditions. And as these elements are considered together, they reveal that the true significance of the victory lies in the way these qualities were brought into alignment, creating a system that was capable of responding effectively to the complexities of the desert environment. And within this alignment, the concept of effort becomes central, as the outcome of the battle reflects not only the actions taken in specific moments, but the cumulative effect of sustained and consistent work carried out over time. And as this cumulative effort is recognized, it highlights the importance of persistence, illustrating how progress is often achieved not through sudden or dramatic changes, but through a steady and deliberate continuation of actions that build upon one another. And within this steady progression, the idea of understanding also plays a key role, as the ability to interpret conditions, to make informed decisions, and to adjust strategies in response to new information contributes directly to the effectiveness of the overall approach. And as this understanding is integrated into the actions of the formation, it creates a sense of coherence that allows for a more controlled and purposeful progression, and within this coherence, the distinction between action and reflection begins to blur, as each informs and supports the other, creating a continuous cycle that reinforces the effectiveness of the approach. And as this cycle is maintained, it ensures that the victory achieved is not only a result of past actions, but also a foundation for future ones, providing a basis upon which further progress can be built. And within this broader perspective, the meaning of victory becomes more complex and more enduring, extending beyond the immediate outcome and into the ongoing development of understanding and capability, illustrating that what is achieved in one moment can continue to influence what follows, shaping not only the direction of the campaign, but the way in which it is approached and understood over time. And as this deeper meaning begins to take shape, it invites a more reflective and balanced view of the battle, one that acknowledges both its immediate impact and its lasting significance, allowing it to be seen not only as an event, but as part of a larger and more continuous journey. As this deeper understanding of victory continues to unfold, it gradually shifts the focus away from the external measures of success and toward the internal qualities that made that success possible, creating a perspective in which the outcome of the battle is seen as a reflection of the processes and principles that guided it, rather than as an isolated or self-contained achievement. And within this perspective, the idea of continuity once again becomes central, as the victory is understood not as an endpoint, but as part of an ongoing progression that connects past efforts to future possibilities. And as this connection is explored, it reveals how each phase of the journey contributes to the next, creating a chain of experience and understanding that extends beyond the boundaries of any single engagement. And within this chain, the role of learning becomes increasingly important, as the ability to draw insight from experience and to apply that insight in new contexts ensures that progress is not only maintained, but also expanded. And as this process of learning is carried forward, it transforms the victory from a static result into a dynamic source of growth, one that continues to influence actions and decisions long after the battle itself has ended. And within this ongoing influence, the human element remains a central part of the narrative, as the individuals who participated in the battle carry with them the experience and understanding that shape how they approach future challenges. And as this experience is integrated into their actions, it contributes to a broader sense of resilience and awareness that supports the continued effectiveness of the formation. And within this resilience, the meaning of victory takes on a more personal dimension, reflecting not only what was achieved collectively, but also how it was experienced and understood individually. And as these individual and collective perspectives come together, they create a more complete and nuanced understanding of the battle, one that acknowledges both its practical and its reflective aspects. And within this nuanced understanding, the victory is no longer defined solely by what happened, but by what it represents, illustrating the importance of preparation, coordination, adaptability, and sustained effort in achieving meaningful and lasting outcomes. And as this representation is considered, it reinforces the idea that the true value of the battle lies not only in its immediate success, but in its ability to inform and guide future actions, ensuring that its impact continues to be felt beyond the moment in which it occurred. And as the narrative moves toward its final conclusion, this deeper understanding of victory provides a sense of clarity and balance, bringing together the various elements of the story into a cohesive whole that reflects both the complexity of the experience and the enduring significance of what has been achieved, allowing the journey to reach a point of calm and thoughtful completion. Chapter 10, Segment 3. The Last Quiet, when the story comes to rest. As the narrative reaches its final moments and the long journey through the desert, the battle, and its many layers of meaning begins to settle into stillness. There is a gradual return to the simplest image that has remained constant throughout, the vast and open desert, stretching endlessly beneath a quiet sky, unchanged in its form yet deeply connected to everything that has unfolded within it. And within this return, there is a sense of completion that does not arrive suddenly, but emerges slowly as each part of the story finds its place within a larger and more balanced understanding. And as this understanding takes shape, the details of movement, strategy, and action begin to soften, no longer demanding attention in the same way, but instead becoming part of a wider awareness that holds them gently rather than urgently. And within this softened perspective, the battle itself becomes something that has passed, not forgotten but settled, existing now as a memory that no longer requires response. And as this shift occurs, the focus moves away from what was done and toward what remains. And what remains is not the noise or the motion, but the meaning that has been carried forward through each stage of the journey. And within this meaning, there is a quiet recognition of the effort that was given, the coordination that was achieved, and the resilience that was maintained, all of which contributed to an outcome that extends beyond its immediate context. And as these elements are brought together, they create a sense of continuity that links the beginning of the story to its end, illustrating how each moment has contributed to a larger and more cohesive whole. And within this continuity, the desert once again becomes central, not as a place of conflict, but as a space of reflection, where the traces of what has occurred are not visible, but are understood through the awareness of those who consider them. And as this awareness deepens, it invites a final moment of stillness, where the narrative no longer moves forward, but instead rests, allowing the full scope of the experience to be felt without the need for further explanation or continuation. And within this stillness, the connection between past and present becomes clear, as the events of the battle are no longer separate from the quiet that follows them, but are integrated into it, forming a single and unified experience that exists across time. And as this unity is recognized, it brings with it a sense of calm, a feeling that the journey has reached a natural conclusion, not because there is nothing more to see, but because everything that needed to be understood has already been revealed through the unfolding of the story. And within this calm, the desert remains vast and silent, holding within it memory of what has taken place, not as something that needs to be remembered actively, but as something that exists quietly, part of the landscape of understanding that has been created through the journey. And as the narrative gently settles into this space, it allows for a final reflection that is not focused on action or outcome, but on the simple presence of what has been, offering a moment of stillness that brings the entire experience to rest. As this stillness continues and the final moments of the narrative unfold, there is a sense that the history is no longer something that needs to be followed step by step, but something that can simply be held in awareness, allowing its meaning to exist without the need for further structure or progression. And within this state, the elements that once defined the journey, movement, coordination, decision, and reflection, are no longer separate, but have come together into a single and cohesive understanding, one that does not require repetition or emphasis, because it is already complete. And as this completeness is felt, it brings with it a quiet sense of closure, not as an ending that closes something off, but as a natural point of rest that allows the experience to settle fully into place. And within this rest, the significance of the journey becomes clear in a way that is both simple and profound, revealing that the value of the story lies not only in what has been described, but in the way it has been understood and carried forward. And as this understanding is acknowledged, it creates a connection between the narrative and the present moment, allowing the story to exist not only as something that has been told, but as something that continues to resonate gently and without urgency within the awareness of those who have followed it. And within this resonance, the desert once again provides a quiet backdrop, unchanged and untroubled, offering a sense of continuity that extends beyond the boundaries of the story, reminding us that while events come and go, the space in which they occur remains, holding their memory without being altered by it. And as this perspective settles in, it allows the narrative to release its final tension, to move from something that has been actively engaged with into something that can simply exist, complete and at rest. And within this final transition, there is no need for a dramatic conclusion or a definitive statement, because the journey itself has already provided everything that is needed, and as the story comes to its natural close, it leaves behind a sense of quiet understanding, a recognition that the experience has been fully explored and gently brought to rest. And within this understanding, there is space for reflection, for appreciation, and for the simple acknowledgement of what has been shared. And as the final moments pass, the narrative fades not into silence, but into a calm and enduring awareness, one that remains present without demanding attention, ensuring that the story continues to exist in a way that is both complete and open, allowing its meaning to be carried forward in whatever way it is needed. And as everything finally settles, the desert remains vast and quiet, holding the story within it, not as something that has ended, but as something that has found its place. And as the story comes to a quiet close, we're left not just with what happened, but with what it meant, the echoes of history, the lessons carried forward, and the silence that remains long after the events have passed. If you found this journey meaningful, take a moment to subscribe and join us for more stories that uncover the past in a calm, immersive way. Until next time, thank you for being here.